A wild Mustang mare stood at the edge of Sarah Mitchell's property, her coat matted with blood and sweat, a tiny, barely breathing foal cradled against her trembling legs. The mare's eyes, wide with desperation, fixed on the cabin where Sarah stood frozen on the porch. Most wild horses would flee at the sight of humans, but this mother had traveled miles with her dying baby, seeking out the one person who might save it. The question was, why had this untamed creature chosen Sarah, and what happened next would change both their lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She inhaled deeply, savoring the stillness. This was her favorite time of day, before the demands of running a small horse rehabilitation sanctuary took over. 5 years ago, she left behind a successful veterinary practice in Denver to establish Wild Hearts Ranch, a place where injured and traumatized horses could heal. It wasn't the life she had planned, but after losing her husband Michael to cancer, the city had felt too confined, too full of memories. Sarah took another sip of coffee, her eyes scanning the sprawling meadow that stretched toward the pine forest marking the edge of her property. Something moved at the tree line, a shadow separating itself from the darkness. She squinted, setting her mug down on the porch railing. A horse, moving slowly, emerged from the forest. "Strange," she murmured. Her 5 rescue horses were all accounted for in the stable. This had to be a wild Mustang from the herd that sometimes grazed in the foothills several miles away. Wild Mustangs rarely ventured this close to human dwellings, especially alone. The horse, a mare, moved with a halting gait that immediately signaled distress to Sarah's trained eye. Something was wrong. She reached inside the door for her binoculars, focusing quickly on the animal. The mare was a beautiful dun color, her coat streaked with dirt and what looked troublingly like blood. But it was what lay half hidden against her legs that made Sarah's breath catch. A tiny foal, barely moving, pressed against its mother's side, as if the mare was using her body to hold the baby upright. "Oh no," Sarah whispered, already moving. She hurried down the porch steps, but stopped abruptly, calculating. A wild Mustang with a foal in distress would be unpredictable, potentially dangerous. The mare might see her approach as a threat. Sarah knew better than most how powerful a mother's protective instinct could be, but then something happened that defied everything Sarah knew about wild horses. The mare looked directly at her, not with fear, not with aggression, but with what Sarah could only describe as deliberate intent. Then, incredibly, the horse began walking toward her. "This isn't possible," Sarah whispered to herself, rooted to the spot. The mare's approach was slow, pained. Now Sarah could see that the foal was in terrible condition, its spindly legs buckling, its breathing shallow and irregular. The tiny creature couldn't have been more than a day or 2 old. Something had gone very wrong. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities: infection, injury, birth complications. Whatever it was, the foal needed immediate attention. But first, she needed to somehow gain the mare's trust. Wild Mustangs had every reason to fear humans. They were rounded up, separated from their herds, sometimes chased by helicopters and trucks during Bureau of Land Management operations. "This mare should have been running away, not approaching." "Easy, girl," Sarah called softly, keeping her voice low and steady. "I won't hurt you." The mare stopped about 30 feet away, nostrils flaring, sides heaving with exertion. The foal slumped against her, barely conscious. Sarah could see now that it was a colt, his coat a pale buckskin that would have been beautiful if not for the alarming pallor and the tremors running through his tiny frame. Sarah took a tentative step forward, then another. The mare's ears flicked, but she didn't retreat. Another step. Sarah kept her movements slow, telegraphed, her hands visible. "I can help," she said, though she knew the words meant nothing to the horse. It was the tone that mattered, the calm, in her voice. 20 feet, 15. At 10 feet, Sarah stopped, respecting the invisible boundary she sensed between them. The mare's breath came in rapid huffs, her eyes rolling with exhaustion and stress, but still, she didn't flee. The foal made a sound then, a weak, rasping attempt at a wicker that stabbed at Sarah's heart. Whatever hesitation she had vanished. "This baby was dying. I need to touch him," Sarah said, taking another careful step. "Please." What happened next would stay with Sarah for the rest of her life. The mare, this wild creature who had every evolutionary instinct telling her to flee from humans, took a deliberate step toward Sarah. Then another. When just 5 feet separated them, the mare stopped and did something extraordinary. She nudged the foal ever so gently toward Sarah. Sarah moved on instinct now, kneeling slowly. The foal's legs gave out, and he slumped to the ground, his breathing alarmingly shallow. As Sarah reached out, the mare made a soft, broken sound. Not threatening, but pleading. Sarah's hands touched the foal's neck, feeling for his pulse. It was there, but weak and irregular. His body was burning with fever. "It's an infection," Sarah said, her veterinary training kicking in. "He needs antibiotics, fluids." She looked up at the mare. "I need to take him to the barn. I can help him there." The mare's eyes never left Sarah's face. There was an intelligence there, an awareness that transcended what should have been possible. The wild Mustang took one step back, as if to make room. Sarah didn't hesitate. She gathered the foal into her arms. He weighed almost nothing, just skin and fragile bones. His head lolled against her chest, his eyes barely open. The mare made another sound, this one sharp with anxiety. "Follow me," Sarah said, rising carefully with her precious burden. "You can come too." She turned and began walking toward the barn, moving steadily but not too quickly, conscious of the mare behind her. She didn't look back, and didn't need to. She could hear the soft footfalls, feel the presence of the mother horse following, staying close to her baby. The barn was warm, the smell of hay and horses comforting and familiar. Sarah's 5 rescue horses nickered from their stalls, curious about the newcomers. She went straight to the treatment area she had set up for medical interventions, gently laying the foal on a thick bed of clean straw. Only then did she look back. The mare stood in the doorway, her powerful body tense, caught between 2 instincts, to flee from the enclosed human space or to stay with her baby. Sarah held her breath. This was the moment of truth. The mare took one step inside the barn, then another. She had made her choice. "Thank you for trusting me," Sarah whispered. The next hours passed in a blur of focused activity. Sarah worked methodically, starting an IV to deliver fluids to the severely dehydrated foal, administering a broad-spectrum antibiotic, checking his temperature, 105.2, dangerously high, and cleaning a badly infected umbilical cord that was the likely source of the infection. Sarah had treated many foals with navel ill, as the condition was called, but never one so young, so weak, and never the offspring of a wild Mustang who somehow knew to seek human help. Through it all, the mare, whom Sarah had started mentally, calling Willow for her slender grace despite her exhaustion, stood guard, watching Sarah's every move. She allowed Sarah to approach, to touch her baby, to insert needles and attach monitoring equipment. The level of trust was unprecedented, extraordinary. "Your baby's very sick," Sarah explained as she worked, keeping up a running commentary to accustom the mare to her voice. "But we've caught it in time, I think. He's a fighter, like his mama." The foal's breathing remained shallow, but as the antibiotics and fluids began to take effect, his pulse strengthened slightly. Sarah knew the next 24 hours would be critical. She made a small nest of blankets on the floor of the treatment area, preparing to keep vigil through the night. As darkness fell outside, Sarah paused her work to quickly feed her other horses, making phone calls to cancel the volunteer who was supposed to come help the next day, and to a neighbor who could check on her other animals if needed. When she returned to the treatment area, she found Willow had lain down beside her. Foal, her body curled protectively around him. The mare's eyes tracked Sarah, still watchful, but no longer panicked. Sarah settled onto her makeshift bed, her back against the wall where she could observe her patients. Questions tumbled through her mind. How had this mare known to come here? To Sarah's ranch, specifically? The closest wild herd roamed almost 15 miles away, across difficult terrain. Had Willow somehow observed Sarah's sanctuary from afar? Had she seen Sarah working with the other horses? More importantly, how had the mare known that her foal's condition required human intervention? The infection would have killed the baby within hours without antibiotics, something no wild horse could provide. It was as if the mother had made a conscious decision, weighing the risk of approaching humans against her baby's certain death. "Without help, you're quite the mystery," Sarah said softly to the mare. Willow's ears swiveled toward Sarah's voice, her intelligent eyes reflecting the soft barn light. Outside, a spring storm rolled in from the mountains, rain pattering against the metal roof of the barn. The sound was soothing, rhythmic. Sarah checked the foal's vital signs again. His temperature had dropped a degree, a good sign. The antibiotics were working. She adjusted his IV, gently stroking his neck. He was still critical, but Sarah allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. Around midnight, Sarah must have dozed off, her body giving in to exhaustion. She woke with a start, to a soft sound, the foal trying to lift his head. Sarah scrambled to his side, checking his vitals again. His temperature had dropped further, now closer to normal. His eyes, though still glazed with fever, seemed more alert. "Hey there, little fighter," Sarah whispered. The foal made another weak attempt to rise. Not strong enough yet, but the instinct was there, another good sign. Willow had risen to her, feet watching anxiously. Sarah looked up at the mare. "He's doing better," she assured her. "The medicine is working." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The mare stepped closer, lowering her head to nuzzle her baby. The tenderness of the gesture brought unexpected tears to Sarah's eyes. It had been a long time since she had allowed herself to feel this deeply about anything or anyone. After Michael's death, she had poured herself into her work, focusing on animals because they were safer than people. They couldn't leave you, couldn't die of cancer at 41, and take your planned future with them. Yet here she was, caring desperately about this wild mare and her foal, this mother who had made an impossible choice, and this baby fighting against all odds. The storm intensified outside, wind howling around the corners of the barn, rain turning to hail that clattered against the roof. Willow's ears flicked nervously at the sounds, but she remained steadfastly beside her foal. Sarah returned to her blanket nest, settling in for the long night ahead. "You know," she said to Willow, "I've worked with horses all my life, but I've never seen anything like what you did today." The mare's eyes remained fixed on her. "You should have been afraid of me. You should have hidden your baby away somewhere safe, not brought him to a human." Sarah pulled her knees up to her chest, suddenly feeling the chill of the spring night. "I had a baby once," she found herself saying, the words emerging unbidden. "A little girl. She would have been 16 this year." Sarah hadn't spoken of this to anyone in a very long time. There were complications. She only lived for 3 days. Willow's gaze never wavered. There was something in that steady regard that loosened something in Sarah's chest, a knot she had carried for too long. "After that, I threw myself into veterinary school. Animals made more sense than people. They didn't offer empty platitudes or tell me it was God's plan. They just were, present, real." Sarah wiped her eyes. Michael understood that. He never pushed me to get over it or to try again. He just loved me through it. The foal made a soft sound, his legs twitching. In sleep or perhaps dream, Sarah checked his IV, adjusted his blanket. And then I lost Michael too. Cancer. Fast and brutal. She breathed deeply, steadying herself. So I came here, started this place. It was supposed to be our retirement dream, you know. A place where we could help horses that nobody else wanted. Willow took a step closer to Sarah, her movement deliberate. Sarah went still as the wild mare stretched out her neck, her velvet muzzle inches from Sarah's face. They stayed like that, suspended in a moment of impossible connection. "Why did you choose me?" Sarah whispered. "How did you know?" The mare exhaled softly, her breath warm against Sarah's cheek. Then, delicately, she pressed her forehead against Sarah's shoulder, a gesture of such trust, such deliberate connection, that Sarah felt something inside her crack open. For the first time since Michael died, Sarah Mitchell cried without restraint, her tears soaking into the coat of a wild horse who had no reason to trust humans, yet had entrusted her with the most precious thing in her world. Outside, the storm began to subside, the rhythmic pounding of hail giving way to gentler rain. Inside, a different kind of storm was passing, grief finally finding expression, trust forming between species that had every reason to fear each other, and a tiny foal whose life hung in balance, his every breath a testament to his will to survive and his mother's extraordinary choice. Dawn was still hours away, but in the warm light of the barn, surrounded by the soft sounds of horses breathing and rain falling, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in a very long time. Not happiness exactly, but a kind of peace, a sense that maybe, just maybe, the world still held possibilities she hadn't imagined. The little foal's ears twitched, his eyes moving beneath closed lids. Dreaming, Sarah thought, fighting, living. Willow had returned to her baby's side, lying, down again with her body curved protectively around him. But she kept her gaze on Sarah, that deep, knowing look that seemed to transcend the barriers between their species. Sarah leaned her head back against the barn wall, allowing exhaustion to claim her at last. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The foal wasn't out of danger yet, and there would be decisions to make about Willow. A wild Mustang couldn't simply stay at a private ranch. There were laws, regulations. But those were problems for tomorrow. For now, in this quiet moment between night and dawn, it was enough that a wild mother had trusted a human woman with her baby's life, and that trust had not been misplaced. The soft glow of sunrise filtered through the barn windows, casting long golden rectangles across the straw-covered floor. Sarah jerked awake, momentarily disoriented. Her neck ached from sleeping upright against the wall, and her mouth felt dry. Then she remembered the mare, the foal, the extraordinary night. She scrambled to her feet, eyes immediately seeking out her patience. The foal lay where she had left him, his tiny ribcage rising and falling with each breath, still alive. Beside him, the wild Mustang mare, Willow, was already alert, her intelligent eyes tracking Sarah's movements. "Good morning," Sarah said softly, approaching with slow, deliberate movements. The mare's ears flicked forward, acknowledging her presence without fear. Something had solidified between them during the night, a bond that defied explanation. Sarah knelt beside the foal, her trained hands gently examining him. His temperature had dropped further, now only slightly elevated. The IV bag was nearly empty. She would need to prepare another. Most importantly, when she pressed her stethoscope to his chest, his heartbeat was stronger, more regular. "You're fighting, aren't you, little one?" she murmured. The foal's eyes, clearer now than they had been the night before, seemed to focus on her face. He made a soft, nickering sound. Weak, but present. Sarah felt a surge of cautious hope. Willow stretched her neck toward Sarah, her nostrils flaring. as she took in Sarah's scent. Then, in a gesture that took Sarah's breath away, the mare gently pressed her muzzle against Sarah's arm, not pushing, not demanding, but connecting. "You're welcome," Sarah whispered, understanding the gratitude in the gesture. The moment was interrupted by the sound of tires on gravel outside. Sarah tensed and Willow's head shot up, ears pricked toward the potential threat. Sarah had forgotten. Ethan was supposed to deliver feed this morning. "It's okay," she assured the mare, though she wasn't entirely certain herself. How would Willow react to a stranger? More importantly, what would Ethan make of a wild Mustang in Sarah's barn? The barn door creaked open, and Ethan Bradley's tall figure appeared, backlit by the morning sun. At 38, Ethan was ruggedly handsome in an unpretentious way, his face weathered from years working outdoors, his dark hair perpetually tousled. He had taken over his family's feed business 3 years ago when his father retired, and he'd been supplying Sarah's ranch ever since. "Morning, Sarah," he called, then stopped abruptly when he spotted Willow. His hand froze on the door. "What the—" "Careful," Sarah warned quietly. "She's wild." Ethan remained perfectly still, his experienced eyes taking in the scene. The mare, the foal on the makeshift bed, the medical equipment. "That's a Mustang," he said unnecessarily. "A wild one. Didn't I know? In your barn. I know that too. With a foal that looks half dead." Sarah sighed. "He's doing better, actually. But yes, they showed up yesterday. The foal has an infection, navel ill. I've been treating him through the night." Ethan stayed by the door, wisely keeping his distance. Willow had risen to her feet, her body positioned between the newcomer and her foal, her posture alert but not yet aggressive. "How'd you get a wild Mustang to let you near her baby?" Ethan asked, genuine amazement in his voice. Sarah shook her head. "I didn't. She brought him to me." At Ethan's skeptical look, she added, "I'm serious. She walked right up to the house and practically pushed the foal toward me. It was the strangest thing I've ever seen." Ethan let out a low whistle. That's not possible." "I know what I saw." Sarah crossed her arms, suddenly defensive. "She sought me out, Ethan, specifically." He held up his hands in a placating gesture. "I believe you saw it. I'm just saying it doesn't make sense. Wild horses don't seek out humans, especially not with their young." "Well, this one did." Sarah knelt again beside the foal, checking his IV, "and I'm glad she did. Another few hours and he would have been gone." Ethan remained by the door, but his expression had softened. "Need any help?" Sarah considered. She did need supplies, more antibiotics, electrolytes, milk replacer in case the foal couldn't nurse. And she couldn't leave the barn, not with the foal still critical, and certainly not with Willow's trust so newly established. "Actually, yes," she admitted. "I could use some things from town, and if you could unload the feed and check on my other horses in the south pasture, that would be a lifesaver." Ethan nodded, already pulling out his phone to take notes. Sarah rattled off what she needed, watching as he typed each item. "I can be back in 2 hours," he promised. "Will they be okay until then?" Sarah looked at the foal, at Willow standing protectively nearby. "I think so. He's stabilizing." And she glanced at the mare with a mixture of wonder and uncertainty. "She's not going anywhere." After Ethan left, Sarah changed the IV bag and administered another dose of antibiotics. The foal tolerated the treatment better than he had the night before, his eyes more alert, his movements slightly stronger. She tried coaxing him to stand, supporting his fragile weight, but his legs still buckled beneath him. Not yet, but soon. "He needs a name," Sarah said to Willow, who watched every movement with unwavering attention. "We can't just keep calling him the foal or little one." The mare's ears pricked forward at the sound of Sarah's voice. "How about Phoenix?" Sarah suggested, "because he's rising from the ashes." She considered it, then shook her head. "Too dramatic. Besides, you're the one who saved him, bringing him here." Sarah sat back on her heels, studying the tiny creature. His coat, now that it was drying properly, revealed itself to be a beautiful buckskin, with a distinct dorsal stripe running down his spine, a primitive marking inherited from his wild ancestors. Spirit, she finally decided. His name is Spirit. Willow lowered her head to nuzzle her foal, and Sarah took it as approval. While waiting for Ethan to return, Sarah focused on getting Willow to eat and drink. The mare was clearly exhausted and dehydrated from her ordeal. Sarah brought fresh water and high-quality hay, placing them within easy reach. Willow eyed the offerings cautiously, but hunger and thirst eventually won out. She drank deeply, then began picking at the hay, all while keeping her body positioned to see both her foal and Sarah at all times. Sarah took the opportunity to examine Willow from a respectful distance. The mare was young, probably no more than 5 or 6 years old, and despite her current exhausted state, her conformation was exceptional. Her legs were straight and strong, her chest deep, her head refined with large, expressive eyes. She bore the hallmarks of Spanish ancestry common in many Western Mustang herds: compact body, low-set tail, distinctive facial features. And she was smart, incredibly smart, to have made the decision to seek human help rather than retreating to isolated terrain, as most wild horses would have done with a sick foal. Beneath her dun coat, Sarah could see scrapes and scratches, evidence of a difficult journey. Some looked like they might have come from pushing through dense underbrush or scrambling down rocky slopes. How far had Willow traveled to reach Sarah's ranch? And again, the question that kept circling in Sarah's mind: why here? Why her? The sound of Ethan's truck returning pulled Sarah from her thoughts. He entered the barn more confidently this time, carrying bags of supplies. Willow tensed but didn't retreat, seemingly having classified Ethan as a non-threat after his earlier visit. "How's the patient?" he asked, setting down the bags. "Holding his own," Sarah replied. "I've named him Spirit." Ethan smiled, the expression warming his usually serious face. "Fitting." He glanced at Willow. "And Mama?" "Willow. At least that's what I'm calling her." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Getting attached, Mitchell?" Sarah bristled slightly. "They're wild, Ethan. I know that. She's free to leave whenever she wants." She gestured toward the open barn door. "But right now her baby needs medical care." Ethan raised his hands in surrender. "I didn't mean anything by it. Just, you know there are regulations. The BLM... I know all about the Bureau of Land Management and their regulations." Sarah cut him off, perhaps more sharply than she intended. "But this is an emergency medical situation. Different rules apply." In truth, Sarah wasn't entirely sure about the legal implications of having a wild Mustang on her property. Technically, all wild horses and burros on public lands belonged to the federal government and were protected under the Wild Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act. Private citizens couldn't just take them in. But surely exceptions existed for medical emergencies. She made a mental note to research the regulations more thoroughly once the immediate crisis had passed. Ethan didn't push the issue. Instead, he helped Sarah unpack the supplies he'd brought: more antibiotics, electrolytes, milk replacer, fresh bandages, and high-calorie feed formulated for nursing mares. "I checked your other horses," he reported. "All 5 accounted for and looked good. That old Appaloosa, Domino, he was limping a bit." Sarah nodded. "His arthritis acts up in damp weather. I'll check on him later." They worked together efficiently, preparing medications and organizing supplies. Ethan had grown up around horses. He knew his way around a barn and wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. Despite their occasional friction, or perhaps because of it, Sarah valued his help and his straightforward manner. There weren't many people she would have trusted in this situation. "You think the foal will make it?" Ethan asked quietly as they finished. Sarah looked at Spirit, who had managed to lift his head and was trying to nuzzle his mother. His movements were weak, but the fact that he was moving at all was encouraging. If we can get him through the next 24 hours, maybe. She didn't want to be too optimistic. Foals could crash quickly, especially one as compromised as Spirit had been. The infection is responding to the antibiotics, but he's still very weak. Ethan studied her face for a moment, then nodded. If anyone can pull him through, it's you. The simple vote of confidence caught Sarah off guard. She and Ethan had a friendly professional relationship, but they weren't particularly close. His words carried a weight she hadn't expected. "Thanks," she said, suddenly self-conscious. She busied herself with checking Spirit's vital signs again. "I can stay," Ethan offered. "Help you keep watch." Sarah hesitated. Willow had accepted Ethan's presence, but another person in the barn for an extended period might stress her. On the other hand, Sarah was exhausted, and having another set of experienced hands would be invaluable if Spirit took a turn for the worse. "Okay," she decided, "but we need to give them space. Too much human presence might overwhelm Willow." They set up a small monitoring station at the far end of the treatment area, where they could observe without crowding the horses. Sarah showed Ethan how to read the monitoring equipment and what signs to watch for. As they worked, she found herself telling him the full story of the previous evening. How Willow had appeared at the tree line, how she had deliberately approached, how she had seemed to understand that Sarah could help her baby. "I know how it sounds," she concluded, noting the skeptical set of his mouth. "But I swear, Ethan, it was like she knew, like she made a conscious decision to trust me with what mattered most to her." Ethan was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the mare who stood vigilant beside her foal. "My grandfather used to tell stories," he said finally. "He grew up on the Crow Reservation in Montana. Said the old people believed some animals had medicine, special powers or wisdom, call them helper animals or something like that." He shrugged, a little embarrassed. "Said they could sense things humans couldn't, connect in ways we don't understand." Sarah looked at him with surprise. Ethan had never mentioned native ancestry before. "You think that's what this is? Some kind of spiritual connection?" He laughed, deflecting. "Nah, I think she probably recognized your place as a horse sanctuary. Maybe she's seen you working with the rescues from a distance. Wild horses are observant." "Maybe," Sarah allowed, though she wasn't convinced. Her property was relatively isolated, and while the local Mustang herds sometimes passed through the region, they typically stayed in the higher country miles away. The likelihood of Willow having observed her ranch operations seemed slim. Shut. Rest of the day passed in a rhythm of monitoring, medication, and careful attempts to get Spirit to stand and nurse. By late afternoon, the foal had managed to rise on wobbling legs for a few precious seconds before collapsing back into the straw. Each small victory felt enormous. Ethan proved himself an able assistant, following Sarah's instructions precisely, and offering suggestions born from his own experience with horses. He was particularly good at keeping a respectful distance from Willow while still being available when needed. The mare seemed to have categorized him as an extension of Sarah. Not quite as trusted, but not a threat either. As dusk approached, Spirit made his most significant breakthrough yet. With Sarah supporting his hindquarters and Ethan ready to catch him if he fell, the foal managed to stand long enough to nurse from his mother for the first time since arriving at the ranch. It was brief, less than a minute, but the nutritional and immunological benefits of the mare's milk would far exceed anything Sarah could provide with formula. "That's it," Sarah encouraged, tears pricking at her eyes as she watched the wobbly foal instinctively finding his way to his mother's milk. "Good boy, Spirit." Willow stood perfectly still, allowing her baby to nurse despite the humans hovering nearby. Her eyes met Sarah's over her foal's bobbing head, and in that gaze, Sarah saw something that transcended species. A mother's fierce love, her determination to see her baby survive, and perhaps even gratitude. When Spirit finished nursing and collapsed back into the straw, exhausted by the effort but stronger than before, Sarah and Ethan retreated to give the horses space. They sat on bales of hay at the edge of the treatment area, sharing a thermos of coffee Ethan had brought from his truck. "You done good, Doc," Ethan said, using the nickname few people still called her. Sarah had left her veterinary practice behind when she moved to Wyoming, but Ethan had discovered her background when they first met and occasionally slipped into using the title. "We're not out of the woods yet," Sarah cautioned, but she couldn't keep the hope from her voice. "But he's stronger than I expected. He's got a fight in him." "Like his mama," Ethan observed, watching Willow, who had positioned herself to rest, while still keeping her body between the humans and her foal. "She's something else entirely." Sarah nodded, taking a sip of the strong coffee. "I keep wondering where she came from, why she chose this place." She glanced at Ethan. "Your grandfather's stories, did they ever explain why a helper animal might appear to someone specific?" Ethan looked uncomfortable, clearly regretting having mentioned his grandfather's beliefs. "It was just old stories, Sarah, nothing scientific." "Humor me," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "He said they came when you needed them, when you were at a crossroads or lost your way. When you need, I don't know, healing or something." He shook his head. "But it's just superstition." Sarah's gaze drifted back to Willow and Spirit. "Lost your way. Healing." The words resonated uncomfortably. Wasn't that exactly what had happened to her after Michael died? She had retreated from the world, buried herself in work, avoided forming new connections. Even this ranch, for all its noble purpose, had become a kind of hiding place. "Maybe," she said finally, "or maybe there are things we don't fully understand." Yet the barn had grown darker as they talked, the only light now coming from the battery-powered lanterns Sarah had set up. Outside, the wind had picked up, whistling around the eaves of the old building. "Another spring storm is approaching." I should go before that hits," Sarah told Ethan, gesturing toward the door where darkness had fallen. "The road gets treacherous in the rain." He hesitated. "What about you? You've been up for almost 2 days straight." "I'll be fine. I can sleep here." She nodded toward her makeshift bed of blankets. "I don't want to leave them." Ethan looked like he might argue, then thought better of it. "I'll come back in the morning. Bring breakfast." Sarah smiled, genuinely grateful. "Thanks, Ethan, for everything today." He nodded, suddenly awkward in the intimate setting of the dimly lit barn. "That's what neighbors do." He stood, gathering his jacket. "Call if anything changes overnight. I don't mind driving back." After Ethan left, Sarah made another check of Spirit's vitals. His temperature had normalized, his heartbeat was stronger, and his breathing had deepened into the regular rhythm of healing sleep. The antibiotics were working. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, Sarah allowed herself to believe that the foal might actually survive. She settled into her blanket nest, her body aching with exhaustion. Across the treatment area, Willow had lain down next to her baby, her body curved protectively around him. The mare's eyes gleamed in the lantern light, still watchful. "We did good today," Sarah told her. "He's getting stronger." Willow's ears flicked toward the sound of Sarah's voice. "Tomorrow we'll try getting him to nurse longer, build up his strength." Sarah pulled a blanket around her shoulders against the spring night's chill. "And then we'll have to figure out what comes next." That was the question she had been avoiding all day. When Spirit recovered, what then? Willow was wild. She belonged with her herd, free on the range. But would she leave without her foal? Would the spirit be strong enough to return to the wild anytime soon? And what about the legal implications? Sarah's rescue license covered domestic horses, not federally protected Mustangs. These were problems for tomorrow, Sarah decided, as exhaustion claimed her. For now, it was enough that Spirit was improving, that Willow had maintained her extraordinary trust, and that for the first time in longer than she could remember, Sarah had allowed someone, Ethan, to help her instead of shouldering everything alone. Outside, the storm broke, rain drumming against the roof. Inside, in the warm glow of lantern light, two mothers from different species kept watch over a tiny life they had both fought to save. And something shifted in the atmosphere of the old barn, something that felt like possibility, like the first fragile shoots of spring pushing through winter-hardened ground. Morning arrived with a chorus of birdsong and the soft patter of retreating rain. Sarah awoke to find her neck stiff from another night on the barn floor, but her discomfort vanished the instant she saw Spirit attempting to stand on his own. The foal's legs splayed awkwardly as he pushed himself up, wobbling precariously for several seconds before collapsing back into the straw. But it was progress, undeniable progress. "Look at you, fighter," Sarah said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Willow stood nearby, watching her foal with the intense focus of a mother gauging her baby's improvement. The wild mare looked better herself. The food and rest had restored some of her strength, though the journey to Sarah's ranch had clearly taken a toll. Her muscles still appeared drawn tight beneath her dun coat, and the scrapes along her flanks were more visible in the morning light. Sarah approached slowly, respectfully, to check Spirit's vital signs. His temperature was normal now, his heartbeat strong and regular. The infection was retreating. She ran her hands gently over his tiny body, checking for any abnormalities she might have missed in the crisis of his arrival. Nothing, apart from the infection. He was perfectly formed, a beautiful example of Mustang genetics. "You're going to be just fine," Sarah told him, stroking the soft patch between his ears. Spirit responded by turning his head toward her touch, his dark eyes curious and alert. The barn door creaked open, and Ethan appeared carrying a thermos and a paper bag that emanated the unmistakable aroma of fresh biscuits. His hair was damp from the light rain, and his boots left wet prints on the concrete aisle. "Breakfast delivery," he announced, keeping his voice low. He nodded toward Spirit. "How's our patient?" Sarah felt an unexpected warmth at his use of "our." Yesterday, Ethan had become part of this strange, improvised family. "Better, much better," she reported, accepting the coffee he offered. "He tried to stand on his own just now." Ethan's face broke into a genuine smile. "That's great news." He set the bag of food on a hay bale and approached slowly, keeping a respectful distance from Willow, who watched him with alert, but no longer alarmed eyes. "Morning, Mama," he greeted the mare softly. Sarah sipped the hot coffee, grateful for both the caffeine and Ethan's thoughtfulness. "I think the crisis phase has passed," she said. "The antibiotics are working. Now it's about building his strength, making sure he nurses regularly, and monitoring for any secondary infections." Ethan nodded, his eyes still on the horses. "So what happens next?" he asked, voicing the question Sarah had been avoiding. She sighed, setting down her coffee. "Legally, I should contact the BLM. Wild horses are federally protected. Technically, I should have reported finding them immediately. But you didn't. I was a little busy saving a dying foal," Sarah replied, a defensive edge creeping into her voice. Ethan held up his hands. "I'm not judging. I'm just wondering what you're planning to do." It was a fair question. Now that Spirit was stabilizing, Sarah couldn't ignore the complicated reality of their situation. Wild Mustangs weren't pets or rescue cases you could simply adopt. There were protocols, regulations, paperwork. "I'm going to call Diane Martinez," she decided, naming the local BLM wild horse specialist. She's reasonable, not just a bureaucrat. I've worked with her before when some of the Mustangs strayed onto private land during last year's drought. Ethan looked relieved. Good. That's good. Sarah shot him a look. You thought I was going to try to keep them illegally, didn't you? He had the grace to look embarrassed. You get attached to the animals you rescue. They're wild, Ethan. They belong on the range with their herd. The words felt right as she said them, but Sarah couldn't deny the pang that accompanied the thought of Willow and Spirit leaving. In just 2 days, they had carved out a space in her heart that would leave a hole when they departed. After finishing her coffee and one of the still-warm biscuits Ethan had brought, Sarah stepped outside to make the call. The air was fresh after the night's rain, the sky scrubbed clean and brilliantly blue. She pulled out her cell phone and dialed Diane's number, watching a hawk circle lazily over the distant pine forest. Diane answered on the 3rd ring, her voice curt and professional. As always, Sarah explained the situation, the mare's unexpected arrival, the foal's critical condition, the medical intervention. You should have called immediately, Sarah, Diane chided, but there was understanding beneath her official tone. I know, but he was dying, Diane. There wasn't time for paperwork. A sigh crackled over the line. Well, you did the right thing medically, but now we need to do this by the book. Sarah could hear Diane shuffling papers. I can be out there by noon. I'll need to document everything, take some photographs, get your official statement. Sarah's stomach tightened. What will happen to them? She asked, dreading the answer. Protocol would be to return them to the herd, assuming the foal is strong. Enough. He's not, Sarah said quickly, perhaps too quickly. He's still very weak. The infection is under control, but he needs time to recover. Days, maybe weeks. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then they'll need to be temporarily relocated to a BLM holding facility where they can receive proper care. The thought of Willow and Spirit being taken to a government-holding pen, likely separated from each other, confined in unfamiliar surroundings, made Sarah physically ill. After everything Willow had risked to save her baby, after the extraordinary trust she had placed in Sarah, what if they stayed here? Sarah suggested, the idea forming as she spoke. Just until the foal is strong enough to be released. I have the facilities and medical expertise. I've already been treating him successfully. Sarah. Diane's voice held warning. It would save the BLM time and resources, Sarah pressed, warming to her argument. No need to arrange transport, no additional strain on your holding facilities. The mayor has already accepted this environment. Moving them now could stress the foal, potentially compromise his recovery. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. You'd need a temporary custodial permit, Diane said finally. There would be inspections, documentation requirements, strict protocols for handling. I can do all that, Sarah promised. You know my credentials, Diane. I ran one of the top equine veterinary practices in Colorado before coming here. And there would be absolutely no training, no imprinting beyond what's necessary for medical care, Diane continued firmly. These are wild animals, not rescues to be tamed. I understand completely, Sarah said, relief washing over her. She hadn't realized how desperately she'd wanted them to stay until this moment. I'll respect their wild nature. I'll bring the paperwork. When I come, Diane conceded, but I'll need to see the situation for myself before making any final decisions. After ending the call, Sarah stood for a moment in the clear morning light, processing what had just happened. She was volunteering to take responsibility for a wild Mustang mare and her foal, creating complications, adding work to her already busy schedule, potentially setting herself up for heartbreak when they eventually returned to the wild. And yet the alternative, letting them be taken away, separated, processed through the impersonal machinery of government protocol, had been unthinkable. When she returned to the barn, Ethan was kneeling beside Spirit, gently supporting the foal, as he made another attempt to stand. This time, the little buckskin managed to balance for almost half a minute before his legs gave out. "BLM's coming at noon," Sarah announced, watching as Ethan carefully lowered Spirit back to the straw. "Wild horse specialist named Diane Martinez." Ethan's expression grew concerned. "They taking them to a holding facility?" "Maybe not," Sarah said, feeling a smile tug at her mouth. "I might have convinced her to let them stay here during Spirit's recovery. She's bringing paperwork for a temporary custodial permit." Ethan's eyebrows shot up. "Seriously? Those are hard to get." Sarah shrugged, trying to downplay her own surprise. "I have the right credentials, and it makes logical sense. Why move a recovering foal if he's already receiving proper care?" Ethan studied her face. "That's the only reason you want them to stay?" "Logical sense?" Sarah felt a flush creep up her neck. "Of course not," she admitted. "I want to see this through. Willow trusted me with her baby's life. I can't just hand them over to strangers now." A slow smile spread across Ethan's face. "There's Sarah Mitchell, I know, always fighting for her animals." "They're not mine," she corrected him quickly. "No," he agreed, his eyes holding hers, "but they matter to you." The simple truth of his words hung in the air between them. Sarah's phone chimed with a text alert, breaking the moment. "My volunteers are coming early," she said, checking the message. "Katie, I need to show her what to do with the other horses, so I can focus on these two before Diane arrives." Ethan nodded. "I should head into town anyway. Supply run." He paused. "Want me to come back when the BLM lady's here? Moral support?" The offer touched Sarah more than she expected. "No, that's okay. But thanks." After Ethan left, Sarah spent the next hour preparing for Diane's inspection. She documented Spirit's vital signs, organized her treatment records, and cleaned the barn as best she could, while still giving Willow and Spirit their space. By the time Katie, a local college student who volunteered at the ranch twice a week, arrived, Sarah had compiled a coherent medical history of the past 36 hours. "Oh my God, they're beautiful," Katie breathed when she spotted Willow and Spirit. The young woman had a genuine gift with horses, but she knew better than to approach a wild Mustang without invitation. "Are they new rescues?" Sarah quickly explained. The extraordinary circumstances of their arrival, watching Katie's eyes widen with each detail. "That's incredible," Katie said when Sarah finished. "The mare actually brought her foal to you for help. I've never heard of anything like that." "Neither have I," Sarah admitted. "And according to Ethan, neither has his grandfather, who grew up on the Crow Reservation and knows all the old stories about animals and their behaviors." Katie's expression grew thoughtful. "My anthropology professor talks about animal-human connections in indigenous cultures, how some animals were believed to carry messages or lessons." Sarah had heard similar ideas before, but had always filed them under interesting cultural beliefs rather than literal possibilities. Now, looking at Willow, who was watching their conversation with those intelligent, knowing eyes, she wasn't so sure. "What kind of messages?" she asked. Katie shrugged. "Depends on the animal and the culture. Horses often represented freedom, power, or journey." She smiled a little sheepishly. "But I'm not an expert. Just stuff we covered in class." Sarah nodded, filing the information away. "Well, right now their message is clear. They need our help. Can you handle the other horses this morning? The BLM is coming at noon, and I need to prepare." Katie agreed, enthusiastically, and Sarah gave her instructions for feeding and exercising the 5 rescue horses, with special attention to Domino's arthritic joints. As Katie headed out to the main stable, Sarah returned her focus to Willow and Spirit. The foal was showing more signs of improvement, attempting to stand more frequently, nursing for longer periods, and showing interest in his surroundings. His eyes, bright and curious, followed Sarah's movements around the treatment area. When she approached, he stretched his neck toward her, his tiny nostrils flaring as he took in her scent. "You're going to charm Diane with those eyes, aren't you?" Sarah murmured, carefully checking the site where the IV had been. The needle mark was healing nicely, with no sign of inflammation. She removed the bandage, deciding it was no longer necessary. Willow stood nearby, more relaxed now, but still vigilant. The mare had established clear boundaries. She allowed Sarah to touch and treat her foal, but she didn't welcome the same contact herself. She accepted food and water from Sarah's hands and tolerated her presence, but maintained the wariness of a truly wild creature. Sarah respected this, careful never to push for more trust than Willow was willing to give. Shortly before noon, the sound of tires on gravel announced Diane's arrival. Sarah went out to meet her, finding the BLM agent stepping out of a government-issue white truck. Diane Martinez was a compact, no-nonsense woman in her 50s, with salt and pepper hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, and the weathered complexion of someone who spent most of her time outdoors. Despite her official capacity, she had always been fair in her dealings with Sarah. "Good to see you, Sarah," Diane greeted her, shaking hands firmly, "though I wish it were under more formal circumstances." "I appreciate you coming out," Sarah replied, "and I apologize again for not calling immediately." Diane waved this off. "Let's see this miracle pair of yours." Sarah led her to the barn, providing a detailed medical summary as they walked. Diane listened attentively, asking occasional sharp questions about the foal's condition and treatment. When they reached the treatment area, she fell silent, observing Willow and Spirit with a practiced eye. "That's Decatur's mare," she said, after a moment surprising Sarah. "You recognize her?" Diane nodded. "That white star on her forehead is distinctive. She's part of the Copper Canyon herd. Lead stallion is a big black we call Decatur." She pulled out a tablet and made some notes. "Young mare, probably her first foal. She disappeared from our last count about 2 weeks ago. We assumed she'd gone off to foal, which is normal behavior, but when she didn't rejoin the herd," she frowned. "That's at least 15 miles from here, through rough country." Sarah absorbed this information. 15 miles. Willow had traveled 15 miles, with a newborn and then a desperately ill foal to reach her ranch. The enormity of that journey, the determination it represented, made Sarah's chest tight. Why would she leave her herd to come here, she asked. "That goes against everything we know about Mustang behavior." Diane shrugged, though her expression was thoughtful. "Horses are complex creatures, more intelligent than we often give them credit for." She approached Willow slowly, maintaining a respectful distance. The mare's ears flicked forward, alert but not alarmed. "She's in better shape than I expected, given what she's been through." "She's tough," Sarah said, unable to keep the admiration from her voice, and completely focused on her foal. Diane knelt to examine Spirit from a distance, nodding approvingly. "Good color, alert eyes. You've done well with him." She made more notes on her tablet. "The infection, naval ill, you said. That would have been fatal without intervention." "Within hours," Sarah confirmed. "He was barely responsive when they arrived." Diane straightened, her expression serious. "You understand that if I approve this temporary custody arrangement, there are strict protocols, no unnecessary handling, no imprinting beyond what's needed for medical care. The goal is to return them to the wild, to their herd." "I understand completely," Sarah assured her. "I don't want to tame them. I just want to give Spirit the chance to grow strong enough to survive in the wild." Diane studied her face, apparently satisfied with what she saw there. "All right, let's go through the paperwork." They moved to Sarah's small office attached to the main house, where Diane produced forms documenting the Mustang's condition, location, and treatment plan. Sarah provided her veterinary credentials and signed multiple declarations regarding her understanding of wild horse protection laws. "This is temporary custody only," Diane emphasized, as Sarah signed the final form. Initial approval is for 30 days. After that, we reassess. If the foal is strong enough, they go back to the range. If not, we can extend for another 30 days, but that's usually the maximum. Sarah nodded, ignoring the twinge in her chest at the thought of Willow and Spirit leaving in just a month. I understand. The goal is to get him healthy enough to return to the wild. Diane gathered the paperwork, her expression softening slightly. For what it's worth, Sarah, I think you're the right person for this. Not everyone would understand. The balance between helping and interfering with wild horses. Thank you, Sarah said, genuinely touched by the vote of confidence. I'll be back in 2 weeks to check on their progress, Diane added. All business again. Document everything. Feeding, medical treatment, behavior changes. And call me immediately. If there are any complications. After Diane left, Sarah returned to the barn, processing everything she had learned. Willow had traveled 15 miles from her herd, crossing difficult terrain with a newborn foal to reach Sarah's ranch specifically. The coincidence seemed too precise to be random. Somehow, this wild mare had known where to go for help, had perhaps even observed Sarah's sanctuary from a distance, recognizing it as a place of healing. Or was there something more to it? Sarah thought about Katie's mention of horses as messengers in indigenous beliefs, about Ethan's grandfather's stories of helper animals appearing when needed. The rational part of her mind dismissed these as interesting cultural metaphors. But standing in the barn, watching Willow nuzzle her foal with tender attentiveness, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something extraordinary had connected. In them, something beyond scientific explanation. Spirit attempted to stand again, his legs steadier than before. This time he managed to balance for nearly a full minute before gently folding back into the straw. Progress, small but significant. Progress. 30 days, Sarah told the pair softly. We have 30 days to get you strong enough to go home. Willow lifted her head, her intelligent eyes meeting Sarah's. The mare made a soft nickering sound, acknowledgement perhaps, or simply response, to a friendly voice. Either way, Sarah felt the connection between them solidify, a wordless understanding that transcended the usual boundaries between wild and tame, between human and animal. Outside, the spring afternoon unfolded in perfect clarity, the kind of day that made Wyoming's harsh winters worthwhile. Inside, in the dim quiet of the old barn, two females from different species continued their unlikely alliance, united by the most fundamental force in nature, a mother's determination to see her child survive. A week passed in a rhythm of small victories. Spirit grew stronger each day, his wobbly attempts to stand evolving into confident balance, then tentative steps, and finally short bursts of unsteady trotting that had Sarah laughing out loud at his determination. The infection had cleared completely, leaving behind a healthy, curious foal whose buckskin coat gleamed with newfound vitality. Sarah documented everything meticulously: Spirit's weight gain, his increasing coordination, his nursing patterns, and his interactions with both his mother and the humans around him. Diane had been clear about the importance of detailed records, but Sarah would have kept them anyway. This remarkable journey deserved to be chronicled. Willow, too, had blossomed under Sarah's care. The mare's ribs no longer showed beneath her. Duncoat and the scrapes from her desperate journey had healed into faint marks that would soon disappear entirely. Though still unmistakably wild, she had developed a level of comfort with Sarah that bordered on trust. She would take food directly from Sarah's hand, stand calmly while Sarah examined Spirit, and even allow brief touches along her neck, a concession that spoke volumes about how far they had come. On the 8th morning after their arrival, Sarah entered the barn to find Spirit executing perfect little circles around his mother, his tiny hooves drumming an excited rhythm on the straw-covered floor. When he spotted Sarah, he broke away from Willow and trotted directly toward her, stopping, just short of her feet with his ears pricked forward inquisitively. "Well, good morning to you too," Sarah laughed, kneeling slowly to his level. Spirit stretched his neck forward, his soft muzzle brushing against her hand, the first time he had initiated contact. The gesture sent a complicated wave of emotions through Sarah. Joy at his trust, pride in his recovery, and a bittersweet awareness that each milestone brought them closer to the day he would leave. Willow watched this interaction with alert eyes, but made no move to intervene. The mare had developed an uncanny ability to distinguish between acceptable human contact and potential threats. She tolerated Sarah completely, Ethan with minimal wariness, and even Katie had been granted provisional acceptance. But when Marcus Jones, the local farrier, had stopped by 2 days earlier to drop off supplies, Willow had positioned herself firmly between the stranger and Spirit, her posture communicating a clear warning. Sarah had begun taking the pair outside for brief periods each day, letting them feel the sun and grass in the small paddock adjacent to the barn. Spirit had been hilariously overjoyed at his first taste of freedom, bouncing and kicking up his heels, while Willow watched with what Sarah could only describe as maternal indulgence. But the mare never strayed far from the barn, never tested the fences, never showed any inclination to escape. It was as if she understood that her foal's recovery wasn't complete, that they still needed this sanctuary. "Ready for some fresh air?" Sarah asked them now, reaching for the rope she used to lead them to the paddock. She never attached it to Willow, that would have crossed a line in their delicate relationship, but simply held it as a directional guide that the intelligent mare had quickly learned to follow. Outside, the mid-April morning was perfect. Cool, but not cold, the Wyoming sun warming the earth without the intensity it would develop in summer. Spirit immediately began to explore, his heightened energy a testament to his improving health. Willow grazed nearby, lifting her head occasionally to track her foal's enthusiastic investigations. Sarah leaned against the paddock fence, savoring the moment. The sound of approaching tires pulled her attention away. Ethan's battered blue truck appeared around the curve of the driveway, moving at its usual unhurried pace. He had fallen into a pattern of stopping by most mornings, ostensibly to check on the Mustang's progress, though Sarah suspected his interest wasn't strictly professional. "They look good," he commented, joining her at the fence. His flannel shirt was rolled up at the sleeves, revealing forearms tanned from outdoor work. "Spirit's getting faster and more coordinated," Sarah agreed. "The infection hasn't affected his development at all, as far as I can tell." Ethan nodded, watching as Spirit attempted a clumsy buck that nearly toppled him over. "How much longer do you think, before they're ready?" Sarah understood the real question beneath his words. How much longer before they leave? Maybe 3 weeks. He's doing incredibly well, but he still needs to build stamina. And I want to make absolutely sure there's no chance of the infection recurring. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "You know, my grandfather would say there's a reason they came to you specifically, a message or lesson of some kind." Sarah glanced at him. Ethan rarely mentioned his native heritage, and when he did, it was usually with a hint of self-consciousness, as if he feared being perceived as superstitious. "What kind of message?" she asked carefully. He shrugged, eyes still on the horses. "That would be for you to figure out. He always said the helper doesn't interpret for you, just delivers what you need." "And what do I need?" The question came out more vulnerable than she'd intended. Ethan turned to her then, his expression serious. "Maybe that's what you're here to discover." Before Sarah could respond, her phone rang. The screen displayed Diane Martinez's name. Sarah answered, sensing Ethan's attention sharpening beside her. "Sarah, we have a situation," Diane said without a preamble. "The Copper Canyon herd is being rounded up for population control. Emergency order came down yesterday." Sarah's stomach dropped. "What? Why?" "Drought conditions are in their usual range. BLM says the land can't sustain the current. Numbers, Diane's voice held controlled frustration. "They're bringing in helicopters tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" Sarah's voice rose in alarm. "That's insane. It's the foaling season." "I know," Diane replied grimly. "I've filed objections, but I'm being overruled. Policy reasons, they say." Sarah's mind raced. BLM roundups were controversial at the best of times, using low-flying helicopters to drive Mustangs into holding pens. During foaling season, the practice was particularly dangerous. Pregnant mares could miscarry from stress, newborn foals could be separated from their mothers or injured trying to keep up. "What does this mean for Willow and Spirit?" she asked. Dreading the answer, Diane sighed. "Once captured, the herd will be processed. Some will be put up for adoption, others sent to long-term holding facilities. If Willow's herd isn't on the range anymore, there's nothing for them to return to," Sarah finished, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "Not necessarily," Diane cautioned. "We could still release them into a different area where there are established herds, but integration would be difficult, especially with a young foal. Another stallion might not accept Spirit." Sarah looked across the paddock where Willow was grooming her foal, her movements gentle and precise. The thought of separating them was unthinkable. The idea of Willow being shipped to a government holding facility, possibly adopted out to strangers, who wouldn't understand her wild nature, made Sarah feel physically ill. "What are our options?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Officially limited," Diane admitted, "but there is something we could consider. Your facility is already licensed for rescue and rehabilitation. If you were to apply for an expansion of that license to include Mustang sanctuary status," hope flared in Sarah's chest. "Is that possible?" "Difficult, but not impossible," Diane said. "It would involve extensive paperwork, facility upgrades to meet federal standards, and a significant financial commitment. But with your background and the unique circumstances of this case, I might be able to support such an application." Sarah's mind whirled with possibilities. "What would I need to do?" "Come to my office this afternoon. Bring your current facility documentation, financial statements, anything that demonstrates your capability to provide appropriate care." Diane paused. "I should warn you, Sarah, even with my support, approval isn't guaranteed, and the timeline would be tight." "I'll be there," Sarah promised, already mentally cataloguing the documents she would need. After ending the call, she turned to find Ethan watching her with concern. "Round up?" he asked, having clearly followed enough of the conversation to grasp the situation. Sarah nodded, relaying what Diane had told her. As she explained the potential sanctuary option, she saw something shift in Ethan's expression. "Let me help," he said when she finished. "I know people on the tribal council who've dealt with the BLM on land use issues. They might have insights on navigating the bureaucracy. You'd do that." His eyes held hers steadily. "You're not the only one who's gotten attached to them, Sarah." Something warm unfurled in her chest at his words. For so long, after Michael's death, Sarah had operated on her own, politely deflecting offers of help, maintaining a careful distance from any emotional entanglements. But now, faced with the possibility of losing Willow and Spirit, she found herself desperately grateful for allies. "Thank you," she said simply. Ethan nodded, then turned practical. "What do you need from me right now?" "Can you stay with them? While I gather the paperwork, I don't want to leave them alone, not with—" She trailed off, unable to articulate the sudden fear that had taken hold of her, as if Willow and Spirit might disappear the moment she turned her back. "Go," he assured her. "I've got nowhere else to be today." Sarah hurried to the house, her mind racing. The documents were easy enough to locate. She kept meticulous records of her rescue operation, but as she gathered them, the magnitude of what she was considering began to sink in. A Mustang sanctuary would mean significant changes to her operation, substantial financial investment, and a very different future than she had planned. When she returned to the paddock with a folder of documents, she found Ethan sitting on the ground inside the enclosure. Spirit had approached him and was investigating his boots with curious lips while Willow grazed nearby, apparently unconcerned. "He came right up to me," Ethan said, his voice soft with wonder. "No fear at all." Sarah felt a pang of worry. Spirit's comfort with humans was both heartwarming and concerning. Wild foals weren't supposed to be this trusting. It could endanger them if they were released back to the range. "He's imprinting," she said. "It's natural at his age, but—" She didn't need to finish the thought. Ethan understood the implications as well as she did. "Maybe he was never meant to be wild," Ethan suggested gently. Sarah sank down beside him, watching as Spirit pranced away to rejoin his mother. "That's not our decision to make," she replied, though the words tasted bitter. "Isn't it?" Ethan challenged. "You're talking about creating a sanctuary. That's a decision about their future." "A sanctuary isn't the same as domestication," Sarah argued. "It's protected land where they can live naturally, just with secure boundaries and supplemental care during harsh conditions." Ethan studied her face. "Is that really what you want? To watch them from a distance? Maintain that separation?" The question hit uncomfortably close to emotions Sarah hadn't fully examined. "What matters is what's best for them," she deflected. He didn't push, but his expression suggested he saw more than she wanted him to. "We should get going if you're meeting Diane this afternoon." The drive to the BLM field office in Cody took just over an hour. Sarah and Ethan traveled mostly in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The landscape flowed past the windows, rolling, grasslands giving way to dramatic rocky outcroppings, the distant mountains still capped with snow even as the valleys greened with spring growth. "It's strange to think of this land without wild horses," Sarah said finally. "They've been here for hundreds of years." Ethan nodded. "My grandfather said the Crow considered them spirit animals, not native like the buffalo, but still somehow belonging to this place more than people do. Yet we're the ones deciding their fate," Sarah observed bitterly. "Some of us are trying to decide it better than others," Ethan reminded her. The BLM office was a modest government building on the outskirts of town. Inside, they found Diane waiting, in a small conference room, surrounded by stacks of paperwork. The wild horse specialist looked tired, the lines around her eyes deeper than they had been a week ago. "Thank you for coming so quickly," she greeted them, shaking hands with Ethan after Sarah introduced him. "We don't have much time." For the next 2 hours, they waded through the complex requirements for establishing a Mustang sanctuary. The financial implications were significant. Secure fencing that met federal standards, approved shelter facilities, guaranteed water sources, veterinary care protocols, and annual inspection fees. The paperwork was equally daunting, requiring everything from environmental impact studies to detailed operational plans. "Normally, this process takes 6 to 8 months, Diane explained, shuffling through yet another form. "We're trying to compress it into weeks, which means calling in every favor I've accumulated in 15 years with the BLM." Sarah's head swam with figures and regulations, but her determination only grew stronger as the meeting progressed. She had the land, 40 acres, with an option to purchase an adjoining 30. She had the expertise and facilities, though they would need upgrading. What she didn't have was unlimited financial resources. "I can contribute," Ethan said suddenly, as if reading her thoughts. When both women looked at him in surprise, he added, "The feed business does well. I've been saving to expand. But this is more important." "Ethan, no," Sarah protested. "This isn't your responsibility." His eyes met hers. "Maybe I want it to be." The simple statement hung in the air between them, laden with meanings neither was ready to fully examine. Diane cleared her throat. While private financial backing will certainly help the application, there's another resource you should consider. She pulled a different file from her stack. The Mustang Heritage Foundation offers grants specifically for sanctuary programs. You'd need to incorporate as a non-profit, but with your background and the unique circumstances of Willow's case, you'd have a compelling application. Sarah seized on this lifeline. How quickly could that happen? The next grant cycle closes in 2 weeks, Diane said. It's tight but possible. By the time they left the BLM office, the afternoon was fading toward evening. Sarah's folder had transformed into a thick packet of applications, forms, and guidelines. The path forward was complicated and uncertain, but it existed, a possibility of creating something permanent out of what had begun as an emergency intervention. On the drive back to the ranch, Sarah was quieter than ever, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was considering. Establishing a sanctuary wouldn't just alter her operation, it would fundamentally change the trajectory of her life. After Michael died, she had deliberately kept her connections temporary, her attachments limited. A sanctuary would mean putting down roots, creating something meant to last. Second thoughts? Ethan asked as they turned onto the gravel road leading to her property. Sarah shook her head. Not about trying to save them. Just processing everything this means. He nodded, understanding more than she had said. You know you don't have to do it alone, right? The simple assertion brushed against Sarah's carefully maintained self-sufficiency. Since Michael's death, alone had felt safer. Alone meant no. One could leave you, no one could die on you, no one could shatter your carefully reconstructed world. But alone also meant no one to share the burden when it grew too heavy to carry. I know, she said softly. When they reached the ranch, Katie's car was still in the driveway. The college student had agreed to stay with Willow and Spirit all day, something Sarah hadn't asked of her before. As they approached the barn, Sarah heard Katie's voice, soft and melodic, apparently reading aloud. They found her sitting on a hay bale in the paddock, an open textbook in her lap. Willow grazed nearby, while Spirit dozed in the late afternoon. "Son, Native American horse mythology," Katie explained, holding up her book when she spotted them. "For my anthropology class, I figured they might appreciate the subject matter." Sarah smiled despite her emotional exhaustion. "How have they been?" "Perfect," Katie reported. Spirit practiced his gallop for about an hour, then crashed hard. "Willow's been super calm." She hesitated, then added, "Something weird, though. When I was reading about horse spirits being messengers between worlds, Willow stopped grazing and just stared at me. For like 5 straight minutes. It was intense." Sarah exchanged a glance with Ethan, whose expression reflected her own thoughts. The coincidence was striking, given their conversation earlier about helper animals and messages. "Probably just interested in your voice," Sarah said, defaulting to the rational explanation. Katie shrugged. "Maybe, but it felt like she was really listening, you know, understanding something I wasn't." After Katie left, Sarah and Ethan brought Willow and Spirit back into the barn for the night. The routine had become familiar: fresh straw, grain for Willow, a final health check for Spirit. But tonight, everything felt charged with new significance. Each action was colored by the knowledge that they were fighting not just for Spirit's immediate recovery, but for both horses' entire future. "I should go," Ethan said finally, lingering by the barn door. "Early delivery tomorrow." Sarah nodded, suddenly reluctant to see him leave. "Thank you. For today, for offering to help with the sanctuary, for all of it. Partners, right?" He said, the word carrying tentative weight. "Partners," she agreed, allowing herself to acknowledge how much she had come to rely on him in such a short time. After Ethan left, Sarah remained in the barn, sitting on her now familiar hay bale as darkness gathered outside. Spirit had curled up in the straw, his tiny body rising and falling with the deep breaths of exhausted sleep. Willow stood nearby, drowsing but still alert, ever the protective mother. "I'm going to try to keep you both safe," Sarah told them softly. "I don't know if I can, but I'm going to try." Willow's ears flicked toward her voice, and the mare turned her head to regard Sarah with those knowing eyes that seemed to see straight through to her core. For a heart-stopping moment, Sarah had the distinct impression that Willow understood perfectly. Not just her words, but the promise beneath them, the commitment being made. Outside, a coyote called in the distance, its lonely cry echoing across the valley. Inside, in the warm sanctuary of the barn, Sarah Mitchell made a silent vow to two wild creatures who had, against all odds and expectations, become the catalyst for her own unexpected journey of healing. Dawn broke with the distant sound of helicopter blades cutting through the morning stillness. Sarah, who had barely slept, was already in the barn checking on Willow and Spirit when she heard it, the mechanical thrum that signaled the beginning of the roundup. Though miles away, the sound carried across the valley, a stark reminder of what was at stake. Willow's reaction was immediate and visceral. The mare's head shot up, ears pinned forward, nostrils flaring as she detected a threat her human companions could barely perceive. A tremor ran through her powerful body, and she moved instinctively to Spirit's side, positioning herself between her foal and the barn door. "It's okay," Sarah soothed, though she knew the words were meaningless against the mare's deeply ingrained fear. "You're safe here." But were they? The question haunted Sarah as she watched Willow's distress. The sanctuary application was underway, the initial paperwork submitted to Diane for preliminary review, but approval was far from guaranteed. If denied, what options would remain for the wild pair? Sarah's phone buzzed with an incoming text. "Ethan." Helicopters started. "Coming over." She texted back a quick acknowledgement, grateful for his support. In just 2 weeks, Ethan had become an essential part of this unexpected journey, offering not just practical help, but a steady presence that Sarah had forgotten how to appreciate. Until now. By the time he arrived 30 minutes later, Willow had settled somewhat, though she remained hypervigilant, her body tense and ready for flight. Spirit, oblivious to the danger his herd faced miles away, had resumed his usual morning explorations of the barn, his improved strength evident in the confidence of his movements. "They've got the eastern sector cordoned off," Ethan reported, grimly, closing the barn door behind him to muffle the distant helicopter sounds. "BLM trucks, temporary corrals, the whole operation." Sarah's stomach twisted. "How many horses have they brought in?" "About 30 when I drove past. They're expecting over 100 by day's end." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "I spoke with one of the wranglers I know, said they've got adoption officials on site already, evaluating the younger ones." The reality of what was happening hit Sarah anew. An entire herd, Willow's family, being systematically captured, processed, and dispersed. Some to adopt, others to government-holding facilities where they might remain for years, their wild spirits slowly dimming behind fences and pens. "Any sign of the stallion?" "Decatur, the one Diane mentioned?" Ethan shook his head. "Not that I saw, but the wranglers said they're focusing on the lead stallions first. They cause the most resistance." Of course they would. The herd stallions would fight desperately to protect their bands, to keep their families together. The thought of Decatur, Willow's mate, Spirit's father, being chased by helicopters, separated from his mares, perhaps even injured in the process, filled Sarah with visceral anger. "It's wrong," she said, the words inadequate against the magnitude of what was happening. "These roundups are inhumane. There are better ways to manage wild horse populations. Fertility control, range expansion, natural predator restoration." Ethan agreed. The science supports it, but science isn't what drives policy. The bitter truth hung between them. Wild horses occupied a precarious position in modern America, neither fully protected as wildlife nor valued as domestic livestock. Caught between romantic cultural symbolism and practical land management politics, they existed at the mercy of shifting government priorities. "We need to focus on what we can control," Ethan said after a moment, placing a steadying hand on Sarah's shoulder. "The sanctuary application, the grant proposal, giving these two a permanent home." Sarah nodded, drawing strength from his practical focus. "You're right. I've started the non-profit incorporation paperwork, and I've been researching successful sanctuary models to develop our operational plan." "Ah?" Ethan echoed, a smile tugging at his mouth. Sarah flushed slightly, realizing what she had said. "Well, you did offer to help, unless you've changed your mind." "Not a chance," he assured her. "In fact, I spent last night looking into sustainable funding models for horse sanctuaries. Most successful ones combine private donations with educational programs, volunteer initiatives, and some form of ecotourism." The thoroughness of his research surprised Sarah. "You've really thought about this?" "Said I was all in, didn't I?" His gaze held hers steadily. "I meant it." Something shifted between them in that moment, a deepening of the partnership that had been forming since Willow and Spirit arrived. For the first time since Michael's death, Sarah found herself seriously considering the possibility of letting someone else into her carefully constructed world. The moment was interrupted by Katie's arrival. The college student burst into the barn, her face flushed with excitement. "You're famous," she announced, holding up her phone. "Well, Willow and Spirit are. My post about them is going viral." "Your what?" Sarah asked, confused. Katie looked suddenly abashed. "I may have posted a few pictures of them on my Instagram with their story. People are obsessed. It's been shared thousands of times overnight." Sarah's initial reaction was alarm. "Katie, they're federally protected wildlife. There are regulations about—" I know," Katie interrupted hastily. "I was careful. I didn't give any identifying details about the location or your name. Just called you a Wyoming horse rescuer and told how the mare brought her sick foal for help. And I mentioned the sanctuary plans." Sarah and Ethan exchanged concerned glances. Public attention was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it could generate support for the sanctuary application and potential donations. On the other, it could attract unwanted scrutiny from officials or create expectations they couldn't fulfill. "Show me," Sarah said finally. Katie handed over her phone. The post featured several beautiful photographs of Willow and Spirit, clearly taken during Katie's reading session the previous day. The caption told their story in compelling, empathetic terms, emphasizing the mare's extraordinary intelligence and maternal devotion. It ended with a plea for support for wild horse conservation efforts and a hint about the sanctuary being planned to protect them. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of likes, hundreds of comments expressing amazement and support, and dozens of shares by wildlife conservation groups and horse enthusiasts. Many commenters were asking how they could help, where they could donate, what they could do to support Willow and Spirit's future. "This could actually be helpful," Sarah admitted, scrolling through the comments. "We need public support for the sanctuary application and donations for the matching funds requirement in the grant." Katie beamed. "That's what I was thinking. I've already had 3 wildlife photographers contact me asking if they could come document their story." "Slow down," Ethan cautioned. "We need to be strategic about this. Too much attention too quickly could complicate things with the BLM." Sarah nodded, handing the phone back to Katie. "He's right, but this does give me an idea. If we could document what's happening at the roundup, show the contrast between that approach and what we're trying to establish here, a public awareness, a campaign." Ethan finished, following her thinking, positioning the sanctuary as a humane alternative. Exactly. Not attacking the BLM directly, that would be counterproductive, but offering a collaborative solution. Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. Katie, do you know anyone in your journalism department who might be interested in helping develop this? The young woman's face lit up. My roommate is a journalism major focusing on environmental issues. She'd be perfect. Set up a meeting, Sarah decided. But first, let's talk to Diane. We need to make sure we don't undermine the application process. The day unfolded in a flurry of activity. While Katie returned to campus to connect with her roommate, Sarah and Ethan worked on refining the sanctuary proposal, incorporating elements that would address potential BLM concerns and emphasize the educational and conservation benefits of the project. Diane called mid-afternoon with an update on the roundup. 72 horses had been captured so far, including 3 pregnant mares who would be monitored closely at the holding facility. Any injuries? Sarah asked, dreading the answer. Minor ones mostly, Diane replied, her voice tight with controlled emotion. 1 yearling sprained a leg trying to keep up. 1 mare has some cuts from the portable corral panels. She paused. Decatur fought hard, took 5 wranglers to finally get him loaded. Sarah closed her eyes, imagining the proud stallion's desperate resistance. Is he okay? Physically, yes, but he's... Diane struggled for words. Different. When they finally got him contained, he just stopped, went still, like something inside him broke. The description sent a chill through Sarah. She had seen that response before in rescued horses who had endured severe trauma, a kind of emotional surrender that went beyond physical defeat. I'm sending through the preliminary assessment of your sanctuary application, Diane continued, changing the subject. The regional director has agreed to expedite the review process, but we still need formal environmental impact statements and detailed operational protocols. We're working on those now, Sarah assured her. And there's something else you should know. The story has gotten some social media attention. Nothing identifying our location or compromising the process, but there's public interest building. Diane was quiet for a moment. That could be useful, actually. The more public support you can demonstrate, the stronger your case. Just be careful about the messaging. We don't want this turning into an anti-BLM campaign. Absolutely not, Sarah agreed. We're positioning this as a collaborative solution, a complement to existing management approaches. After finishing with Diane, Sarah joined Ethan in the paddock, where he was observing Willow and Spirit. The foal had developed a new game, running short sprints toward his mother, then executing dramatic sliding stops just before reaching her. Each performance was followed by prancing circles, clearly seeking acknowledgement of his prowess. Showing off, Ethan chuckled. He's got personality. And confidence, Sarah added, noting how Spirit's earlier uncertainty had been replaced by bold exploration of his environment. His development is right on track, maybe even accelerated. They watched, in comfortable silence, as Spirit continued his antics. The foal's coat gleamed with health, his movements fluid and energetic, a dramatic transformation from the barely conscious creature Willow had brought to Sarah's door just 2 weeks earlier. You know what I keep coming back to? Sarah said. After a while, that first choice Willow made, seeking human help instead of retreating deeper into the wild. It goes against everything we understand about Mustang behavior. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. My grandfather would say she had medicine, special wisdom, or insight. What does science say? Sarah wondered. That complex animals like horses have more sophisticated decision-making capabilities than we often credit them with, Ethan offered. They can weigh risks against benefits, assess threats contextually rather than categorically. So Willow might have calculated that the risk of approaching a human was less than the certainty of losing Spirit if she didn't. Possible, Ethan agreed. Or maybe she'd observed your behavior with other horses from a distance, recognized you as someone who helps rather than harms. Or maybe it's something we don't have a framework to understand yet, Sarah suggested, watching Willow's attentive monitoring of her foal's play. Something beyond our current scientific paradigms. The conversation was interrupted by Spirit, suddenly changing direction and galloping directly toward them, executing a perfect sliding stop just feet away. The foal stood there, head high, ears pricked forward, clearly pleased with himself. I think we have an audience, Ethan laughed. He wants applause, Sarah agreed, clapping her hands softly. Spirit responded by prancing in place, then whirling away for another performance run. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah and Ethan continued working on the sanctuary proposal, occasionally pausing to watch Spirit's increasingly confident explorations. The foal now ventured to the far edges of the paddock, though always within Willow's watchful gaze, testing his growing independence. Around sunset, Katie returned with her roommate Maya Chen, a focused young woman with a camera slung over one shoulder and a notebook already half filled with ideas for documenting Willow and Spirit's story. The key is narrative contrast, Maya explained enthusiastically, juxtaposing the roundup imagery with the sanctuary approach. Not vilifying anyone, but clearly showing the emotional and ethical differences. Her proposal was thoughtful and nuanced, a mini-documentary that would follow the sanctuary application process while telling Willow and Spirit's remarkable story. It would include interviews with experts on wild horse management, sanctuary operators, and BLM officials willing to participate. We're thinking of a crowdfunding component too, Katie added, to help with the matching funds requirement in the grant application. Sarah was impressed with their thoroughness. This could work, but we need to be careful about timing and messaging. The BLM is reviewing our application now. We don't want to create any perception of public pressure tactics. What if we position it as a collaborative model? Maya suggested, highlighting how sanctuaries can complement BLM management strategies, relieve pressure on holding facilities, and provide educational opportunities. It was exactly the approach Sarah had been considering. Let's develop a detailed outline and run it by Diane before proceeding. As dusk deepened into evening, Sarah accompanied the students back to their car, discussing logistics for beginning the documentation process. The distant sound of helicopters had finally ceased, the roundup operations suspended for the night, though they would resume at dawn the next day. When she returned to the paddock, she found Ethan leading Willow and Spirit back to the barn for the night. The comfortable domesticity of the scene struck her with unexpected force. Willow following Ethan with easy trust, Spirit trotting alongside with occasional playful detours, and Ethan's quiet competence in handling them without restraint or domination. They respect you, Sarah observed, as they settled the horses in their stall. Ethan shrugged modestly. They tolerate me because they trust you. I'm just benefiting from your connection. But Sarah knew it was more than that. Ethan had his own way with the horses, patient, undemanding, content to exist in their presence without imposing his will. It was a quality rare among humans, particularly those raised in ranching culture where horses were often viewed as tools or commodities rather than partners. I talked to Marcus about coming out to look at the perimeter fencing, Ethan mentioned, as they closed up the barn. He knows a contractor who specializes in BLM-approved wildlife corridors and enclosures. Might help fast-track that part of the application. The thoughtfulness of his initiative touched Sarah. You didn't have to do that. Wanted to, he said simply. Partner, remember. The word carried more weight each time it was spoken between them. Sarah found herself wondering where the boundaries of that partnership might eventually settle. Professional colleagues, friends, or something more. The possibility no longer filled her with the alarm it might have even a month ago. They walked together toward the house, the spring evening wrapping around them with the soft chirping of crickets and the distant hooting of a great horned owl. The stars were emerging in the clear Wyoming sky, brilliant in the absence of urban light pollution. "Stay for dinner?" Sarah offered impulsively. "Nothing fancy, just soup and bread, but it's homemade." Ethan's smile was answer enough. Inside, as Sarah heated the soup she'd prepared the previous day, they continued refining the sanctuary proposal, identifying potential challenges and developing contingency plans. The work was engrossing but companionable, their complementary skills creating a natural rhythm of ideas and solutions. Later, as they sat at Sarah's small kitchen table, the conversation drifted to more personal territory. "You never talk about before," Ethan observed. "Denver, your veterinary practice, your husband." Sarah tensed slightly, her spoon pausing halfway to her mouth. "Not much to tell that matters now." "It all matters," he countered gently. "It made you who you are." The simple assertion pierced through Sarah's practiced deflections. For years, she had separated her life into before and after. Before the loss of her baby, before Michael's death, before her carefully constructed world had shattered. She had come to Wyoming to escape the weight of those memories, but in doing so, had cut herself off from the full continuity of her own story. "I had a good practice," she said finally. "Specialized in sport horses mostly, though I did some small animal work too. Michael was a wildlife biologist with the State Conservation Department. We met when I treated an injured hawk he'd brought in." The memory surfaced with unexpected clarity, Michael's gentle hands cradling the wounded raptor, his voice low and soothing as he explained how he'd found it. "We were happy, had plans. Then I got pregnant, and we were ecstatic." She paused, the familiar constriction tightening her throat. Ethan waited, not pushing, simply present. There were complications during delivery. Grace lived for 3 days. Sarah kept her voice steady through long practice. "We thought we'd try again, eventually. But then Michael was diagnosed with an aggressive form of lymphoma. 8 months. From diagnosis to death." "I'm sorry," Ethan said, the simple words free of the platitudes Sarah had come to dread. "After he died, I couldn't stay in Denver. Too many memories, too many well-meaning friends trying to help." She traced the rim of her soup bowl with one finger. "This place was actually his dream originally. A retirement project we talked about, somewhere to help horses that needed rehabilitation. When I found this property for sale, it felt like, I don't know, a sign maybe. A way to honor what we'd planned together." Ethan nodded, understanding in his eyes. "And now? Is it still his dream you're pursuing, or has it become your own?" The question caught Sarah off guard. She had never quite framed it that way before, the distinction between honoring Michael's memory and building her own future. "Both, maybe," she ventured. "At first it was just about keeping a promise, preserving something of him. But now..." She thought about her rescue horses, about the satisfaction she felt when they recovered and thrived. "Now it's mine too, different than we planned, but still meaningful. And the sanctuary. Where does that fit?" Sarah considered this. It wasn't part of the original vision, but it feels right somehow, like the next logical step. Or maybe the step you were always meant to take, just by a different path than you expected, Ethan suggested. There was wisdom in his words that resonated with Sarah's own evolving understanding of her journey. Perhaps all the loss and pain had been steering her toward this moment, this opportunity to create something larger than her original plans, not just a retirement dream, but a lasting legacy of conservation and compassion. As they continued talking, into the evening, Sarah found herself sharing stories of her life with Michael that she hadn't spoken aloud in years. Not just the tragic ending, but the joy and purpose they had shared, the dreams they had built together. And in the telling, something shifted inside her. a loosening of the rigid separation between before and after, a recognition that all of it was part of a continuous, if interrupted, journey. When Ethan finally left around midnight, Sarah felt both emotionally drained and strangely lightened. She checked on Willow and Spirit one last time before bed, finding them peacefully resting in their stall. Spirit was curled against his mother's side, his tiny body rising and falling with deep, healthy breaths. Willow lifted her head briefly as Sarah entered, acknowledging her presence before settling back into her resting position. "We're going to figure this out," Sarah promised them softly. "All of us together." As she turned to leave, Sarah noticed something she hadn't seen before, a small, fresh scrape on Willow's shoulder, likely from the mare rubbing against something in the paddock. Nothing serious, but a reminder of the wild mare's physical vulnerability. Sarah retrieved a first aid kit and approached carefully, speaking softly to alert Willow to her intentions. The mare remained calm as Sarah gently cleaned the scrape and applied antiseptic ointment. A small interaction, but one that highlighted the extraordinary trust that had developed between them. As Sarah closed the barn door behind her, the night sky stretched vast and star-filled above her. Somewhere out there, miles away, Willow's herd, or what remained of it, was spending their first night in captivity. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more paperwork, more uncertainty. But for the first time in years, Sarah faced the future not with resignation, but with determination. Not alone, but surrounded by unexpected allies in both human and equine form. And in that realization lay the first hints of the message Ethan's grandfather might have spoken of, that healing rarely comes in expected forms or follows anticipated paths. Sometimes it arrives on four legs, wild and desperate, asking not for safety but offering the profound gift of trust against all instinct and odds. The BLM holding facility buzzed with activity, workers moving purposefully between portable pens, veterinarians conducting assessments, and adoption specialists evaluating the captured Mustangs. Sarah stood at the perimeter fence, her heart heavy as she surveyed the scene. After 3 days of relentless helicopter operations, the Copper Canyon roundup was complete. 113 wild horses, Willow's extended family, now stood in crowded pens, their once free spirits contained behind metal barriers. "This way," Diane directed, leading Sarah and Ethan toward the administrative area. "The facility. Manager approved your visit as part of the sanctuary application process, but we need visitor badges." Sarah nodded, her attention caught by a large black stallion in a separate enclosure. Unlike the other horses who paced nervously or huddled together for comfort, this one stood absolutely still, his head lowered, his powerful body somehow diminished despite its physical strength. "Is that him?" she asked softly. "Decatur?" Diane followed her gaze. "Yes, he hasn't eaten since arrival. Veterinarians are monitoring him, but—" She didn't need to finish. Sarah had seen this before. The profound psychological impact of captivity on wild animals, particularly those with strong herd leadership roles. It wasn't just freedom Decatur had lost, but identity, purpose, the entire social structure that gave meaning to his existence. "Spirit's father," Ethan murmured, his voice tight with controlled emotion. The significance of those words hung in the air between them. This proud, broken creature was the sire of the vibrant Foal, now prancing around Sarah's paddock, the mate who had protected Willow until something, illness, separation, or instinct, had driven her to seek human help instead. After receiving their visitor badges, they followed Diane through the facility. The Mustangs watched their passage with wary eyes, some retreating to the far corners of their pens, others approaching cautiously, perhaps hoping for release. Sarah noted many pregnant mares, their swollen bellies a stark reminder of the poor. The timing of the roundup. Most of the younger horses will be put into the adoption program, Diane explained as they walked. The older ones, or those deemed unadoptable, will go to long-term holding facilities in the Midwest. And the pregnant mares, Sarah asked, they'll remain here until they foal. Then the same process applies, adoption assessment for both mare and foal. The clinical efficiency of it all struck Sarah as profoundly at odds with the complex social structures and familial bonds these animals naturally formed. Herds that had evolved together over generations were being systematically dismantled, categorized, and redistributed based on human convenience rather than equine needs. They reached the facility manager's office, a portable trailer with the Department of Interior seal on the door. Inside, Roger Whitman, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and the straight-backed posture of a former military officer, greeted them with professional courtesy. "Ms. Mitchell," he acknowledged, shaking her hand, "I've reviewed your preliminary sanctuary proposal. It's interesting." The careful neutrality in his tone suggested skepticism rather than enthusiasm. Sarah straightened her shoulders, prepared for the uphill battle she had anticipated. "Thank you for considering it," she replied evenly, "and for allowing us to visit the facility." Roger gestured for them to sit. "I understand you're currently providing temporary care for one of our Mustang mares and her foal. A rather unusual situation." "Extraordinary circumstances," Sarah agreed. "The mare sought human assistance when her foal was critically ill. That speaks to remarkable intelligence and adaptability." Roger's expression remained impassive. "Or perhaps simply desperation. Either way, the temporary custody arrangement expires in 2 weeks, at which point standard protocol would be to integrate them into our adoption program." Sarah felt Ethan tense beside her, though his face revealed nothing. They had anticipated this position, the by-the-book approach that would separate Willow and Spirit from each other and from the sanctuary they had begun to trust. "That's actually why we're here," Sarah said, leaning forward slightly. "We believe there's a more beneficial alternative, both for these specific horses and for BLM resource management long-term." For the next 30 minutes, Sarah presented their sanctuary proposal in detail, emphasizing the benefits: reduced pressure on BLM holding facilities, educational opportunities for the public, research potential on Mustang behavior and adaptation, and a humane approach to population management that could serve as a model for future conservation efforts. Ethan contributed strategic points about land management and sustainable funding models, while Diane occasionally interjected with regulatory clarifications. Throughout, Roger listened attentively, his expression giving away nothing of his thoughts. "Your proposal has merit on paper," he acknowledged when they finished. "But establishing a new sanctuary requires substantial resources and expertise. The BLM has had mixed experiences with private sanctuaries in the past, some excellent, others problematic. That's why we're pursuing official certification and accreditation," Sarah countered. "We want to work within the system, not against it." Roger nodded thoughtfully. "There's also the matter of the mare and foal currently in your care. You've developed what sounds like a significant bond with them." "A respectful relationship," Sarah clarified. "We recognize and honor their wild nature. And yet you want to keep them permanently instead of allowing them to be adopted into private homes where they might be gentled, trained, given purpose." The implication was clear. Roger viewed adoption and domestication as the preferred outcome for captured Mustangs. Sarah chose her next words carefully. "We're not proposing to keep them as individuals so much as to establish a sanctuary where they and others can live as naturally as possible while still receiving necessary protection and care. The mare has already demonstrated extraordinary intelligence and decision-making capacity. We believe she has more to teach us if given the opportunity to thrive in a setting that respects her nature." Roger leaned back in his chair, studying Sarah with renewed interest. You were a veterinarian in Denver, correct? Specialized in sport horses? The question caught Sarah off guard. Yes, for nearly 15 years. And yet now you advocate for minimal human intervention with these Mustangs. That's quite a philosophical shift. Sarah hadn't considered it that way before, but he was right. Her professional career had been built around optimizing horses for human purposes, making them sound, responsive, and competitive. Now she was arguing for the value of horses simply being horses, living according to their natural instincts within protected boundaries. I've evolved, she admitted. Working with rescue horses, I've come to appreciate that our relationship with equines doesn't have to be based on control and utility. There's value in preservation as well as domestication. Roger seemed to appreciate her honesty. I'll need to consult with the regional director before making any decisions. In the meantime, I'd like to see your facility firsthand. Assess whether it meets or could be upgraded to meet federal standards for a wild horse sanctuary. Hope flickered in Sarah's chest. This wasn't approval, but it wasn't rejection either. We'd welcome that, she assured him. As they prepared to leave, Roger asked to speak with Diane privately. Sarah and Ethan stepped outside, finding themselves near Decatur's enclosure once again. The stallion had moved to the water trough, but didn't appear to be drinking, merely standing with his muzzle near the surface. He's giving up, Ethan observed quietly. Sarah nodded, her throat tight. Wild stallions often do when captured. Their entire identity is built around freedom, protection of their herd. When that's taken away... He's Spirit's father, Ethan said again, as if testing the weight of those words. Sarah understood the direction of his thoughts. Diane would never approve moving him to a private facility. He's too valuable genetically, too iconic within the herd. But if we were an officially approved sanctuary, the possibility hung between them, tantalizing but remote, reuniting Spirit. With both his parents recreating at least a fragment of the family unit that had been shattered, it was a beautiful vision, but one that would require extraordinary bureaucratic exceptions. Diane emerged from the office, her expression carefully neutral. Roger wants to visit your facility tomorrow morning, she told them. He's bringing the regional environmental assessment officer. That's good, right? Ethan asked. It's progress, Diane replied cautiously. Don't get your hopes too high, but don't give up either. On the drive back to the ranch, Sarah found herself unusually quiet, processing everything they had seen. The holding facility, for all its clinical efficiency, had been profoundly disturbing. Row upon row of confined wild spirits, family groups separated, natural behaviors suppressed. The contrast with Willow and Spirit's current situation was stark. You okay? Ethan asked as they turned onto the gravel road leading to Sarah's property. Just thinking about Decatur, she admitted, and all the others. The mares are about to give birth in those pens instead of in the open range. The foals who will never know freedom. She shook her head. Even if we succeed with the sanctuary, it's still just a small solution to a much larger problem. You can't save them all, Ethan said gently, but you can make a real difference for some. That matters. His pragmatic compassion anchored her. You're right. One step at a time. Back at the ranch, they found Katie and Maya already there, filming Spirit's increasingly athletic antics in the paddock. The foal had developed a new skill, rearing up on his hind legs, pawing at the air before dropping back down and spinning in tight circles. Willow watched these performances with what Sarah could only describe as maternal tolerance. He's showing off for the camera, Katie laughed as they approached. Been doing this routine for the past hour. Maya lowered her camera, her expression serious. How was the holding facility? Sarah gave them a brief overview, including Roger's guarded interest in the sanctuary proposal and his planned visit the next day. We should include his inspection in the documentary, Maya suggested. It shows the collaborative process, the legitimate efforts to work within the system, rather than against it. If he agrees, Sarah cautioned, we can't film without permission. I'll ask Diane to request authorization, Ethan offered. Frame it as transparency and public education. While they discussed logistics for the next day, Sarah entered the paddock to check on Willow and Spirit. The foal immediately trotted over, his confidence around humans now fully established. He nuzzled Sarah's hand, perhaps hoping for the apple slices she occasionally brought as treats. "Sorry, buddy, not today," she told him, stroking his sleek neck. Spirit responded by playfully nudging her arm, then prancing away to resume his performance for the camera. Willow approached more sedately, her movements measured and deliberate as always. The mare stopped a few feet from Sarah, her intelligent eyes seeming to ask questions Sarah wished she could answer. Had Willow somehow sensed the day's events? Did she understand that her fate and spirits hung in the balance of human decisions and regulations? "We're trying," Sarah told her softly. "I promise we're trying." Willow stretched her neck forward, her nostrils flaring slightly as she took in Sarah's scent. Then, in a gesture that still had the power to humble Sarah, despite its increasing frequency, the wild mare stepped closer and gently rested her forehead against Sarah's shoulder, a gesture of trust and connection that defied conventional understanding of Mustang behavior. "They've bonded with you," Ethan observed, having quietly entered the paddock behind her. Sarah nodded, careful not to disturb the moment. "Not just me. Us. This place. They feel safe here." Willow maintained the connection for several seconds, more before lifting her head and moving away, returning to her watchful oversight of Spirit's playground activities. "I've been thinking," Ethan said as they watched the horses together, "if Roger approves the sanctuary concept, but not the inclusion of Decatur." "We focus on what we can accomplish," Sarah finished for him. "One victory at a time." He looked at her with appreciation. "Exactly. We start with Willow and Spirit, establish the operational model, and prove it works. Then we can advocate for family band preservation as the next phase." His strategic thinking complemented Sarah's passionate advocacy. Together, they made a more effective team than either would have been alone, a realization that continued to surprise and comfort her. As evening approached, they prepared the barn and paddock for Roger's inspection the next day. Katie and Maya helped clean and organize, while Ethan repaired a loose board on the paddock fence. The collaborative energy reminded Sarah of barn preparation days before horse shows in her previous life. The communal effort, the shared purpose, the anticipation. After the students left, Sarah and Ethan sat on the porch with mugs of coffee, watching the sun set behind the distant mountains. Spirit had finally exhausted himself and was napping in the paddock while Willow grazed nearby. The peaceful scene belied the uncertainty of their future. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Sarah said, breaking their comfortable silence, "I want to thank you. I couldn't have done any of this alone." Ethan's expression softened. "You wouldn't have had to. That's what community is for." "I forgot that," she admitted. "After Michael died, I got so used to handling everything myself, proving I didn't need anyone. It became a habit, then an identity. And now?" Sarah considered the question seriously. "Now I'm remembering that independence doesn't have to mean isolation, that accepting help isn't the same as being dependent." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. Big difference between being alone because you have to be and being alone because you choose to be. The insight resonated deeply. For years, Sarah had told herself her solitude was a choice, a preference. But in truth it had been a defense mechanism, a way to protect herself from further loss by avoiding new connections. "Tomorrow's going to work out," Ethan said with quiet confidence. "Maybe not exactly how we hope, but we'll find a way forward." Sarah wanted to believe him. The stakes felt impossibly high, not just for Willow and Spirit's future, but for her own. Somehow the wild mare and her foal had become catalysts for Sarah's own healing, challenging her carefully constructed barriers, inviting her back into a world of connection and vulnerability she had deliberately abandoned. "I should head home," Ethan said eventually, setting down his empty mug. "Early start tomorrow." As he stood to leave, Sarah made an impulsive decision. "Or you could stay. In the guest room," she added quickly. "Save you the drive back and forth." The invitation surprised them both. Sarah hadn't had an overnight guest since moving to Wyoming, hadn't allowed anyone that level of access to her private space. "You sure?" Ethan asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Yes," she said, finding that she meant it. "It's practical, and I'd appreciate the company tonight." The simple admission of need felt like both a surrender and a victory. Later, after showing Ethan to the small guest room and making a final check on the horses, Sarah stood in her kitchen, a strange sense of peace settling over her despite the uncertainty ahead. Her home felt different with another person under its roof, not invaded as she might have feared, but somehow more complete, as if the cabin itself had been waiting for voices besides her own. From the guest room, she could hear Ethan's phone, conversation with Marcus about additional fencing materials, planning for a future that was still unguaranteed. His quiet confidence was contagious. Sarah's gaze fell on a photograph she kept on the refrigerator, herself and Michael standing beside their first joint purchase, a rescued thoroughbred named Apollo. They looked so young, so certain of their shared future. For years after Michael's death, looking at those images had brought only pain. Now, unexpectedly, she felt something different, a gentle appreciation for what had been, without the crushing weight of what had been lost. "We're building something new," she told the smiling faces in the photograph, "not replacing what we planned, but creating something I think you'd be proud of." Outside, an owl called into the gathering darkness. 3 distinctive hoots followed. By silence, from the barn came the soft, reassuring sounds of horses settling for the night. And from the guest room, Ethan's voice continued its steady murmur, making plans, solving problems, looking ahead. Sarah moved to the window, gazing out at the stars emerging above her land. 40 acres that had once represented escape and isolation, but now held the possibility of transformation into something larger than herself. A sanctuary, yes, but perhaps not just for wild horses. The morning would bring Roger's inspection and all its attendant tension. Decisions would be made that could alter multiple futures, Willow's, Spirit's, her own. But for now, in this quiet moment between day and night, Sarah allowed herself to feel the tentative unfurling of hope. Not the desperate, clutching hope of someone drowning, but the steady, patient hope of seeds planted in good soil, waiting for the right conditions to grow. Tomorrow will come with its challenges, but for the first time in years, Sarah Mitchell wouldn't face them alone. And in that knowledge lay a different kind of freedom. Not the wild, unfettered freedom of Mustangs on the range, but the deliberate freedom of choosing connection over isolation, possibility over fear, future over past. In the paddock, illuminated by the rising moon, Willow lifted her head from grazing, her ears turning toward the house as if sensing Sarah's thoughts. For a moment, the mare and woman regarded each other across the distance. 2 mothers who had both lost and found, suffered and survived, and now stood at the threshold of an unexpected shared journey that neither could have anticipated. Sarah raised her hand in silent acknowledgement. Willow's ears flicked forward, her posture alert and present. Then she returned to grazing, a simple action that nonetheless conveyed profound trust in the safety of her current surroundings. Tomorrow would decide much, but tonight had already revealed something equally important, that healing often arrives. in forms we neither expect nor recognize until they have already begun to transform us from within. 1 year later, the Wyoming summer stretched golden across the valley, painting the landscape in warm hues of amber and green. Sarah stood on the viewing platform at the edge of the 30-acre enclosure, binoculars raised to scan the gently rolling terrain. In the distance, a small band of Mustangs grazed peacefully. 5 mares, 2 yearlings, and at the perimeter, ever vigilant, the black stallion, whose presence still seemed miraculous after everything they had overcome. "See them?" Ethan asked, joining her on the platform. His hand came to rest naturally at the small of her back, a casual intimacy that had developed over months of shared purpose and growing connection. "By the eastern pond," Sarah confirmed, passing him the binoculars. "Spirits showing off again." Ethan focused the lenses, chuckling as he spotted the yearling colt, no longer tiny but still unmistakable with his buckskin coat and distinctive white star that mirrored his mother's. Marking. Spirit was prancing sideways, his movements exaggerated and playful as he tried to engage one of the other youngsters in a game of chase. "Just like his father," Ethan observed. "All confidence and charm." Sarah smiled, remembering the desperate, dying foal Willow had brought to her doorstep 15 months earlier. That frightening beginning seemed almost impossible to reconcile with the vibrant, healthy yearling now frolicking across the sanctuary grounds. The Wild Hearts Mustang Sanctuary had officially opened 6 months ago, after a year of intense work, bureaucratic negotiations, and community support that had exceeded Sarah's wildest expectations. What had begun as an emergency intervention for 1 mare and foal had evolved into a model conservation program that now provided protected habitat for 14 Mustangs rescued from holding facilities. The journey hadn't been straightforward or easy. Roger's initial inspection had been rigorous, his questions pointed, his standards exacting. The regional director had expressed skepticism about the entire concept, particularly the inclusion of Decatur in the program. It had taken months of persistent advocacy, detailed planning, and strategic alliance building to secure the necessary approvals. Maya's documentary had proven unexpectedly influential, capturing not just Willow and Spirit's remarkable story, but the larger issues of wild horse management in the American West. When it won a prestigious Student Film Award and was picked up by a streaming service, the attention had brought both challenges and opportunities. Increased scrutiny from officials, but also a surge in donations and volunteer support. Tour groups arriving, Ethan noted, gesturing toward the gravel parking area where a small bus was pulling in. "Katie's leading this one, right?" Sarah nodded. "College students from the environmental science program in Laramie. They're interested in our grazing management model. Educational outreach had become a core component of the sanctuary's mission, not just telling Willow and Spirit's emotional story, but using it as an entry point to explore sustainable approaches to wild horse conservation. 3 days a week, the sanctuary hosted guided tours for students, conservation groups, and the general public, carefully designed to observe without disturbing the Mustang's natural behaviors. As they made their way down from the viewing platform, Sarah reflected on how much had changed in the past year, not just the physical transformation of her property into a functioning sanctuary, but the deeper evolution of her own life. The woman who had once defined herself by isolation now led a small but dedicated team, collaborated with university researchers, and navigated complex relationships with government officials and conservation advocates. And then there was Ethan, whose initial offer of help had gradually naturally evolved into something neither of them had anticipated. Their relationship had developed slowly, cautiously, each step forward, accompanied by Sarah's internal struggle with vulnerability and trust. But he had been patient, understanding that her heart needed time to remember how to open itself to possibility. You know what today is, right? Ethan asked as they approached the visitors' center, a converted barn that now housed educational exhibits, office space, and meeting rooms. Sarah smiled. How could I forget? 1 year exactly since Diane approved the expanded sanctuary application. That, too, he acknowledged, but I was thinking of something else. 1 year since this. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, smooth stone, dark grey with a streak of white running through it. Sarah's breath caught. She remembered the day perfectly. They had received the official notification of the sanctuary's approval, and amid the celebration had walked to the eastern edge of the property, where a creek cut through a small canyon. There, overwhelmed by the realization that their impossible dream was becoming reality, Sarah had finally allowed herself to cry, not from grief, but from relief and gratitude. Ethan had found the stone in the creek bed and given it to her as a tangible reminder of that turning point. You kept it all this time? She asked, touching the stone lightly. Carried it every day, he admitted, like a reminder that impossible things can happen if you're stubborn enough to keep fighting for them. The simple sentiment captured so much of what had carried them through the challenges of the past year. Before Sarah could respond, Katie approached from the visitors' center, clipboard in hand, her face lit with excitement. The university group is here, she reported. And Diane just called. She's bringing someone from the National BLM office tomorrow. Apparently they want to study our model for possible implementation in other regions. This was significant news. Validation of their approach at the highest levels. That's wonderful, Sarah said. Let's make sure all the documentation is updated before they arrive. Katie nodded and hurried back to greet the waiting students. In the year since Willow and Spirit had entered their lives, the young woman had transformed from occasional volunteer to the sanctuary's assistant director, postponing graduate school, to help build something she believed in deeply. Should we tell her the other news? Ethan asked quietly as they watched Katie organizing the tour group. Sarah considered this. They had received word that morning that their application for a major conservation grant had been approved, funding that would allow them to expand the sanctuary by an additional 50 acres and potentially rescue another family band from long-term. Holding, let's wait until after the tour, she decided. Give her one success to focus on at a time. They joined the group as Katie began her introduction, explaining the sanctuary's origins and mission. Sarah stood slightly apart, preferring to let Katie lead while she observed the students' reactions. Their faces showed the familiar progression, from polite interest to genuine engagement, as they learned about Willow's extraordinary decision to seek human help for her dying foal. And that's really the foundation of everything we do here, Katie was explaining. The recognition that these horses have complex decision-making abilities, social structures, and individual personalities that deserve our respect and protection. As the tour moved toward the main viewing areas, Sarah noticed a latecomer hurrying from the parking lot, a tall, older Native American man accompanied by a teenage boy. Something about his profile struck her as familiar, though she couldn't immediately place him. When he reached the group and turned, she recognized Ethan's features in the older man's face. "Grandfather," Ethan said, surprise evident in his voice. "Thought we might catch you here," the older man replied with a slight smile. "Your grandmother insisted I should stop being stubborn and see this place you've been talking about for a year." Sarah had heard about Joseph Bradley but had never met him. Ethan's relationship with his grandfather was complicated. Respect and love mingled with the tension of different worldviews and the older man's initial disappointment that Ethan had chosen the feed business over opportunities to work within tribal government. "Sarah, this is my grandfather, Joseph, and my cousin, Micah," Ethan introduced them. "Grandfather, this is Sarah Mitchell, the veterinarian I told you about, the sanctuary director." Joseph assessed Sarah with keen eyes that missed nothing. "The woman the mayor chose," he said simply. The phrasing caught Sarah off guard. Not the woman who saved the horses or the sanctuary founder, but the woman the mayor chose, centering Willow's agency rather than human intervention. "It's an honor to meet you," Sarah said, extending her hand. "Ethan has told me so much." "About you," Joseph nodded, accepting the handshake briefly. "I was skeptical," he admitted directly. "Thought this was just another case of white people playing savior to animals they'd pushed to the edge of existence in the first place." His bluntness was startling, but not entirely unexpected, given what Ethan had shared about his grandfather's perspective on conservation issues. "That's a fair concern," Sarah acknowledged. "We try to be mindful of the complex history and avoid reinforcing problematic power dynamics. The sanctuary exists to provide protected space where the horses can live according to their natural instincts, not to impose our ideas of what they should be." Joseph's expression remained neutral, but something in his eyes suggested approval of her response. "The boy wants to see the horses," he said, gesturing to Micah. "He's been drawing them since Ethan first told the story." The teenager looked embarrassed but nodded. "I'm interested in wildlife illustration," he explained, "especially species with cultural significance." "You've come on a good day," Sarah told him warmly. "The band is active this morning not far from the viewing areas, and we have special permits for artists and photographers to use the advanced observation blinds if you're interested." Micah's face lit up at this information. As they rejoined the main tour group, Sarah found herself curious about Joseph's presence. Ethan had mentioned his grandfather's reluctance to visit, his skepticism about the entire project. What has changed? The tour proceeded to the main observation area, where the Mustang band had moved closer to the fence line. Through powerful spotting scopes mounted on the viewing platform, visitors could observe the horses without disturbing their natural behaviors. Katie expertly pointed out each animal, explaining their histories and roles within the band. "That's Willow," she indicated, focusing one of the scopes on the dun mare who had started it all. "And the buckskin yearling beside her is Spirit, the foal she brought to us when he was dying from an infection. They're the reason the sanctuary exists." The students took turns observing, their excited whispers carrying across the platform. Sarah noticed Joseph standing apart, not using the scopes, but simply watching the distant horses with remarkable intensity. "And the black stallion patrolling the perimeter is Decatur," Katie continued. "Getting him released from the holding facility to join his family here was one of our biggest challenges and greatest successes." At this, Joseph turned to Ethan. "The stallion remembers his role," he observed. "Even after captivity." Ethan nodded. "It took time. When he first arrived, he was still broken in spirit, but being reunited with Willow and meeting Spirit for the first time, something changed. He remembered who he was. The family reunion had been one of the most powerful moments in the sanctuary's development. After months of negotiations, they had finally secured approval to transfer Decatur from the holding facility, a decision influenced by the growing public support generated by Maya's documentary and research, suggesting that keeping family bands intact improved both physical and psychological outcomes for captive Mustangs. The day of Decatur's arrival had been tense, uncertain. The stallion had been transported in a specialized trailer, sedated for his safety and that of the handlers. When released into a small acclimatization paddock adjacent to where Willow and Spirit were kept, he had seemed disoriented, diminished, still the shadow of himself they had observed at the facility. For 3 days he had paced the perimeter, showing little interest in food or water, barely acknowledging the mare and foal who watched him from the adjoining space. Sarah had begun to fear they had made a terrible mistake, that the transfer had come too late, that his spirit had been permanently broken by captivity. Then, on the 4th morning, everything changed. Sarah had arrived to find Decatur standing at the fence line, separating him from Willow, their heads nearly touching through the rails. Spirit had been prancing nearby, his movements conveying an excitement he couldn't fully understand, but clearly felt. When Sarah opened the connecting gate, Decatur had stepped through with newfound purpose, approaching Willow with the formal greeting of stallion to mare. Their reunion, dignified, gentle, profoundly moving, had brought tears to everyone present. But it was his first encounter with Spirit that had truly confirmed the rightness of their decision. The stallion had approached the colt cautiously, nostrils flaring as he took in the scent of his offspring. Spirit, fearless and curious, had stretched his neck forward in greeting. For a breathless moment, the two had stood sniffing each other, taking measure. Then Decatur had done something extraordinary. He had gently nipped Spirit's neck in a gesture of both discipline and acceptance, formally acknowledging the colt as his own. Since that day, Decatur had steadily reclaimed his strength and purpose. Now he was once again the proud, vigilant herd protector, his recovery a living testament to the resilience of the wild spirit when given space to heal. Your grandfather wants to know if what they're seeing is real or just what we want tourists to see, Micah translated from Joseph's quiet crow statement. Ethan smiled. Tell him he's welcome to stay past the tour hours. The horses behave the same whether we're watching or not. As the tour continued, Sarah noticed Joseph gradually drifting closer to where she stood. The mare chose well, he said simply, his eyes on the distant form of Willow. She found a person who understood what was needed. Coming from him, this was significant praise. I'm not sure I understood at first, Sarah admitted. I just knew I couldn't turn them away. Joseph nodded. Recognizing the request is the first wisdom. The meaning comes later. The philosophical observation resonated with Sarah's own journey of the past year. How what had begun as an emergency intervention had gradually revealed deeper purpose and meaning, not just for the horses, but for her own healing. Has the meaning come to you now? He asked, his gaze shifting from the horses to study her face. Sarah considered the question carefully. I think so, she said finally. It wasn't just about saving a foal's life. It was about recognizing that healing happens in community, not in isolation. That goes for horses and humans. A slight smile touched Joseph's weathered face. My grandson said you were learning the right lessons. He looked toward where Ethan was showing Micah how to use one of the high-powered scopes. He has learned. Some too, more than I expected. The simple acknowledgement revealed volumes about the shifting relationship between the generations. Before Sarah could respond, a flurry of activity in the Mustang band caught everyone's attention. Spirit had apparently decided it was time for play and was racing in wide circles around the grazing area, his movements graceful despite their exuberance. Two of the other yearlings joined him, and soon a proper game of chase was underway, the young horses delighting in their speed and agility. Look at them go! Katie exclaimed, quickly adjusting the scopes to track the racing horses. The students crowded around, exclaiming at the display of natural behavior. In the midst of the excitement, Sarah felt a hand slip into hers. Ethan had rejoined her, his presence a quiet anchor amid the activity. Grandfather approves, he murmured close to her ear, of the sanctuary and of you. That's about as high a compliment as he gives. Sarah squeezed his hand in acknowledgement, watching as Joseph pointed out something to Micah, who was sketching rapidly in a notebook. The unexpected visit felt significant, a connection to traditions and perspectives that honored the deeper meaning of their work beyond conservation biology or animal welfare. As the tour began to wind down, Katie guided the group back toward the education center for the final portion of their visit. Sarah and Ethan lingered behind with Joseph and Micah, allowing the teenager more time to sketch the horses. Will you join us for lunch? Sarah invited them. We usually eat at the house after morning tours. Nothing fancy, but plenty of food. Joseph seemed to weigh the invitation, then nodded. The boy has more questions, and I would see where the mare first came with her foal. The significance of this request wasn't lost on Sarah. Joseph wanted to see not just the sanctuary as it existed now, but the specific place where Willow had made her extraordinary choice, the original point of connection that had set everything else in motion. Of course, she agreed. We've preserved that area mostly as it was. We can go there after lunch. As they walked back toward the main compound, Sarah found herself reflecting on the cyclical nature of their journey. What had begun with a desperate mare seeking help for her dying foal had expanded to encompass not just the rescue of an entire family band, but the creation of a model that might influence wild horse conservation more broadly. And through it all, the connections between humans had grown and strengthened alongside those with the horses. Sarah and Ethan, Katie and Maya, and now even Joseph and Micah joining the widening circle. Later, after lunch at the ranch house, Sarah led Joseph to the spot where Willow had first appeared at the edge of the forest, her dying foal barely able to stand beside her. Though the landscape had changed with the seasons, the essential features remained: the tree line, the open space, the clear sight line to what had then been Sarah's porch and was now the smaller of two office buildings. Joseph stood quietly, taking in the scene, his expression contemplative. After a long moment he spoke. My great-grandmother told stories of horse messengers, Mustangs who carried wisdom between worlds. Not everyone could hear them, only those who had suffered enough to listen properly. The words struck Sarah with unexpected force. She thought of her own suffering, the loss of her baby, of Michael, of the future she had planned, and how it had indeed opened her to hearing something she might otherwise have missed. Willow brought more than a sick foal that day, she acknowledged softly. She brought a message I needed to receive. Joseph nodded, seeming satisfied with her understanding. The old stories say the messenger appears when the person stands at a crossroads without knowing it. The horse shows which path leads to healing. From the direction of the sanctuary, the sound of distant nickering carried on the summer breeze, the Mustangs communicating among themselves, living their natural lives within protected boundaries. Not fully wild anymore, perhaps, but not captive either. Something in between, a new possibility that honored both their freedom and their safety. As they walked back toward the house, Sarah spotted Ethan waiting on the porch, his face lighting up when he saw them. Beside him, Micah was showing Katie his sketches, the two young people engaged in animated conversation about art and conservation. Beyond them, the sanctuary stretched toward the mountains, a vision made real through persistence, collaboration, and the unexpected wisdom of a desperate mare who had somehow known exactly where to seek help. The crossroads doesn't end with one choice, Joseph observed, following her gaze. Each day brings new decisions about which path to walk, Sarah nodded, understanding the deeper truth in his words. The sanctuary's creation hadn't been the end of her journey, but rather the beginning of a new one, filled with daily choices about vulnerability and connection, protection and freedom, past and future. As she joined the others on the porch, Sarah felt the weight of the small stone in her pocket. Ethan's gift from the creek bed, his talisman of impossible things made possible through stubborn hope and collective effort. The perfect symbol for a journey that had begun with a wild mother's desperate gamble and continued now toward horizons none of them could fully envision, but were committed to exploring together. In the distance, a Mustang called a distinctive whicker that Sarah recognized instantly as Willow's voice. The mare who had once stood trembling at the edge of the forest, her dying foal pressed against her side, now grazed contentedly with her family band, her remarkable intelligence and courage preserved in the very foundations of the sanctuary. that had grown from her single, extraordinary choice. And in that call across the distance, Sarah heard not just the voice of one brave mare, but an echo of all the messengers who appear at our crossroads moments, those unexpected guides who arrive when we need them most, leading us not away from our pain, but through it toward connections we never imagined possible. They're calling us, Ethan said, nodding toward the sanctuary where the horses had appeared at the nearest viewing point, visible even without binoculars. Yes, Sarah agreed, taking his hand as they prepared to return to their life's work. They always were. And in that simple acknowledgement lay the heart of the message Willow had carried, that healing rarely arrives in expected forms or follows anticipated paths, but comes instead in the moments when we open ourselves to unexpected connection, when we recognize the messengers at our doorstep and find the courage to welcome them in. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.